This Film is Lit, the podcast where we finally settle the score on one simple question. Is the book really better than the movie? I'm Brian, and I have a film degree, so I watch the movie, but don't read the book.
And I'm Katie. I have an English degree, so I do things the right way and read the book before we watch the movie.
So prepare to be wowed by our expertise and charm as we dissect all of your favorite film adaptations and decide if the silver screen or the written word did it better. So turn it up, settle in, and get ready for spoilers, because this film is lit. And out of that contradiction, against unfathomable odds, it's you, only you, that emerged. To distill so specific a form from all that chaos, it's like turning air into gold. It's Watchmen, and this film is lit. Hello and welcome back to This Film is Lit, the podcast where we talk about movies that are based on books. This is a big episode. We got a lot to talk about, so we're not going to dilly-dally because it's a switch episode, and we all know when Brian takes notes, he takes too many. So, anyways, we got a lot to get into. Couple things before we get started. One, we don't normally do content disclaimers, content warnings, because usually we kind of hope or assume that people listening, are familiar enough with whatever specific thing we're talking about, that's not necessary. But in case, for whatever reason, you're not, we will have some discussions of sexual assault at the later point during this episode, among other things. But that would be the big one. And we'll kind of mention it when we get into it. Obviously, you'll know when it's coming. And then the other thing is the version. Okay, so
this is going to cause consternation.
It's going to cause problems. I know with listeners. We're already aware that this is going to annoy some people, and we get it. We watched the theatrical version. Here's why. We wanted to watch the director's cut, and we spent like 20 minutes trying to find.
Yeah.
I should have looked this up ahead of time and went and like rented it or bought it or something online, like a physical copy. There is no streaming version of the director's cut that we could find. It used to be on certain platforms, but it is not any longer from what I was able to find. I'm sure you could pirate it, but we were just watching it on our TV. I want to try to figure out how to pirate it. We had done more research. We could have figured out, hey, we need to figure out how to get this or whatever. Because from everything I've heard, the director's cut is the best version of this movie. There is an ultimate cut that was available some places. I think you had to purchase it. I don't even know if you could have just like watched it or rented it. I think you had to purchase it, which we would consider doing. But the ultimate cut I went and watched read some interviews and stuff with Zack Snyder. He does not really like the ultimate cut because it includes stuff that he thought wasn't good enough. They includes a thing that we'll talk about later, like a whole subplot that he said that they wanted to include, but that they didn't have the ability to film it the way they wanted, so they didn't like how it turned out, but they still put out this ultimate cut with all this extra stuff in it, which I think includes a lot of the stuff in the director's cut, but then even more stuff. So we decided against watching the ultimate cut because Zack Snyder was like, I don't really like it. So we just went with it. It was either the ultimate cut or the theatrical cut. And when it came down to it, we're like, all right, we'll just do the theatrical cut. That's probably the version the most people have seen anyways.
That's also a fair assumption.
Obviously we know there's a lot of big fans out there who, have their own version of the director's cut or other things. Understand all of that. I will try to call out at different points throughout when I know there are things that I'm talking about that are in the director's cut. I know a handful of things that I was able to look up or the ultimate cut. That being said, we did watch the theatrical cut. We're sorry we could not get a hold of the director's cut, which apparently is the superior way to view this film. So I don't think that would change my ultimate verdict, honestly, if I had to guess, based on, kind of what I've read about the director's cut and stuff. I truly don't think it would have changed. I may have liked the movie more, but I didn't really dislike the movie to begin with. We'll get into all of it. So anyways, that's the version discussion. All right. We do not have a guess who. We'll get to that, that's our second segment. But we have everything else. But we're going to start like we always do with a very brief summary. If you have not read or watched Watchmen, let us sum it up for you.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
In alternate history 1985, we see an older man watching TV in his apartment when an unknown assailant breaks in. They fight, but the man is thrown out the window and killed as he falls to the sidewalk below. A credits montage reveals the rise of costumed crime fighters from 1939 to 1977, culminating in a public backlash and passage of an anti-vigilante act. Back in the present, vigilante detective Rorschach investigates the murder, which turns out to be Edward Blake, a former vigilante known as the Comedian. Suspecting that other vigilantes could be attacked, he warns members of his former team, the Watchmen. His former partner, Night Owl / Dan Drayberg, doesn't really buy in, but warns Adrian Veidt. Is it Veidt?
I assume. I don't know.
Veidt.
That's how I pronounce it.
I still feel like we never landed on a way to pronounce Ozymandias.
In the movie, at least once, they say Ozymandias. Like one of the first times he's introduced. But I feel like other times I remember Ozymandias. But they also call him Veidt a lot because that's his name, which is a thing in the book too. They just swap between their hero names and their real names.
I've done that all over my notes.
I do it constantly in my notes too. I will try to make it clear for people who aren't as up on it who is who. I think you'll pick it up pretty quick. It's not that hard.
So he warns Ozymandias, a vigilante who has turned a business mogul. Rorschach also visits Silk Spectre / Laurie Jupiter and Dr. Manhattan / John Osterman. But Osterman, whose research has turned him into a living nuclear weapon, is too wrapped up in his research to listen. Rorschach tracks down one of the comedian's old nemeses, who tells him that Blake recently broke into his apartment and was babbling incoherently about a list of names. Meanwhile, Laurie leaves Dr. Manhattan because he's become too unhuman to emotionally connect with her and seeks solace with Dan. Dr. Manhattan goes on TV, where gotcha journalism reveals that all his old friends are dying of cancer that he supposedly gave them. He gets overwhelmed and teleports to Mars to get away from everyone. Ozymandias survives an assassination attempt, suggesting that Rorschach was correct. Rorschach is then framed for murder and taken to prison. Dan and Laurie decide to put on their costumes again and take Dan's flying plane thing. I was not sure what to call this.
It's Archimedes.
Well, I know the name of it.
It's
but
just like
what
a
is
hovercraft.
it? Okay,
kind of
a hovercraft. So they decide to take Archimedes out for a spin and also break Rorschach out of prison. John teleports Laurie to Mars so that she can convince him to save humanity. They discover that Ozymandias is actually the mastermind behind recent events and go to confront him at his Fortress of Solitude. Laurie and John, meanwhile, discover that the comedian was actually Laurie's father, which makes John want to save the world. Ozymandias, I have questions about that.
I'm just going to say right now, fans, I need you all to just chill. During this, for people who are like, that's not, this is just Katie's interpretation of these events without the clarification that I am going to give shortly. So just, yeah.
But Ozymandias says that it's too late because he's already triggered a bunch of nuclear bombs in various cities, framing Dr. Manhattan in order to unite the world against a common enemy. Dr. Manhattan sees the logic in this and decides to go to another galaxy and become a god, but not before killing Rorschach so that he can't reveal the truth. The film ends with a reporter discovering Rorschach's journal, implying that everyone will find out anyway.
Okay, so I'm not doing a book summary because overall the plots of both of them are similar enough, barring some very big changes at the end that we will obviously discuss. I didn't want to just rehash the exact same thing. Also, yes, Katie's, this is your interpretation of events. We will be adjusting your understanding of some of these events as the episode goes on. I just wanted that to be clear for people, like I said, who are very familiar with this story.
If very familiar super fans or don't like my summary,
no, I think they'll enjoy it.
Then you can feel relieved that I am summarizing the movie.
Yeah. Oh, I think people will enjoy it. I think it's fun. All right. Like I said, we don't have a Guess Who this week. It's a graphic novel. And also, like, all of the characters basically look exactly like their book counterparts. I will describe some places where they don't and some changes they made. But in general, everybody looks exactly like the book version. So, and it's just pictures, obviously, because like I said, it's a graphic novel. So Katie has a lot of questions. So we're going to get right into those. Was that in the book?
Nicholas Flamel is the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone.
The what?
Honestly, don't you two read?
Okay, so right off the bat, the first thing that we see in this movie as somebody breaking into the comedian's apartment. We don't know he's the comedian yet, but we see somebody break in and kill him by throwing him out the window. Does the comic also start off with that scene?
So yes, this is the opening of the book, except slightly different in that we start right after his murder in the book, on the shot of the bloody sidewalk and the smiley face pin on the ground, and then the detectives investigating the murder, and then we get flashes of what happened. So we don't actually start with like the person coming into the apartment and like seeing the whole fight, and then we start with the detectives there kind of figuring out what's happening, and we get little flashes of what happened to the comedian, which is what we see at the beginning of the movie. And I think the movie version of this works fine. I think it was fun getting to see like more of the fight. There's also some fun little Easter eggs in this scene in the movie because he's watching TV, and we don't get to see any of that in the book. It just we just see flashes of like the fight, and he's watching TV, and we get we get a fun little Easter egg reference to the perfume which you wouldn't even have noticed this because I don't even think they say the name of it, but I'm pretty sure it's Nostalgia, which is one of Vite. Vite is like a billionaire who owns like a million different companies that do a million different things. And one of his things is he has a perfume company. And he has a perfume called Nostalgia that is important that we will get to later. And so there's a little scene where somebody's like walking across a fountain, like the top of the water, a fountain, which is a reference to the end of this book. There's a scene where Dr. Manhattan walks across water on a fountain. It's a cool scene that is not in the movie. But I figure that's a reference to that, like a little Easter egg to that. And we also, we do also eventually get the exact opening shot of the book in the movie. It's just not the opening shot of the movie. The shot where we see the pin on the ground and the guy washing the blood off the sidewalk, and then the camera flies all the way up to the like 50th floor or whatever that he was on, and then the detectives there like leaning over the railing looking. That is identically the opening like 6 frames of the graphic novel. So yeah, it is very much identical, just some slight tweaks to kind of the order of events and stuff like that. I also think having him watching the news when this opens, and we have some people on the news, real people. I can't remember. I can't remember who they said. I think it's like Pat Buchanan or somebody like that, arguing about like nuclear proliferation or something like that, kind of setting the stage, setting our scene. And I thought that was a kind of a clever way to establish the world we're in fairly quickly, and like, oh yeah, okay, we're in the 80s. We got like Cold War kind of stuff going on. Deal. So.
For sure. So then following that, we get this pretty long credit montage at the beginning of the movie that shows the original Watchmen, who were the Minutemen, right?
Yeah.
And like kind of follows this like vigilante business through history following World War II up until like where we are now.
Yeah.
And one specific thing was there's a reference to the famous photo of the Victory Day kiss, like the sailor kissing the woman.
Which we found out recently was not consensual.
Yeah.
That was a fun surprise that we all got to learn like in the last couple years.
Yeah. But this movie kind of rewrites it and has one of the vigilantes kiss someone, but it's a female vigilante. So it's that Victory Day kiss, but it's 2 women.
Yes.
And I was wondering if that was from the comic.
It is not, but I thought that was a fantastic, fun little inclusion. So the hero there that we see in that scene is Silhouette, who we see later in that same opening title sequence is murdered along with her girlfriend. I don't know if it's the same girl or not, but it with like her and another woman are like laying in bed and they've been murdered, and it says like lesbian whores or something on the wall. I'll talk a little bit more about them later, but basically the gist of it is, in the book it's explained that she was kicked out of the Minutemen for being a lesbian. Like it gets revealed that she's a lesbian, and they're like, they like vote her out to like preserve their image or whatever. And I thought that using an alternate reality version of that D-Day kiss where the guy takes a picture of it was like or not D-Day, but the Victory Day kiss where the photographer takes a picture of it was kind of a fun, like clever way to work that in. Again, we don't know how they find out she's a lesbian. It's just not really, it's just mentioned that happened with her character or with her. But yeah, so I thought that was fun. I thought that was a really fun little like detail that the movie added.
And then my other question about that montage, we also see that it's the comedian who assassinated JFK in this alternate history. This is that from the comic?
This is strongly implied in the book that the comedian was involved in murdering JFK. But it's not, the movie makes it very concrete. Like, we see him there with a gun. Clearly he did it. There's like jokes, like he jokes about having been there and stuff in the graphic novel. And it's strongly implied that he did. And he was like the shooter on the grassy knoll or whatever, but it's never outright said from my memory. And I did kind of prefer the ambiguous way that the book does it. They overtly say of a couple other important things he was involved in that we'll get to, but not the JFK assassination. That's just alluded to. It also felt kind of, in the movie, felt a little weird and exploitative. I don't know. I wasn't a big fan of just like having that. I get it. I get why they did it. Again, because it is alluded to in the comics, and it's a very striking imagery, like to, kind of set the scene of who this character is and what he gets up to. Because he's basically just like a CIA like operative who just does all kinds of crazy. Well, he's not even CIA. He just works for the government and does all kinds of nonsense, mainly like knocking over Marxist nations in South America primarily. But so that I would say that it's fine that they show it. I prefer the movie kind of alluding to it, but I get why they did it.
So once the movie proper gets started, one of the first characters that we really interact with is Rorschach. Who probably one of the most recognizable, like visually recognizable characters from this. Yeah. And we get a voiceover that are excerpts from his journal.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
I had never seen this movie before. And I don't know if I would have reacted differently to these journal excerpts had I seen it in 2009. Watching it in 2023 was just kind of like, okay, guy.
Oh yeah.
All right, my dude.
No, he's
you're being dramatic. I understand. How similar are the sections that we get from his journal?
Identical. Essentially identical. Like they're word for word. Especially the opening one in particular. Is basically word for word. The voiceovers in the book kind of pepper throughout whenever Rorschach shows up, and we get his journal entries and stuff like that. Again, the opening monologue is identical, including the very famous, "The accumulated filth of all their sex and murder will foam up about their waists, and all the whores and politicians will look up and shout, 'Save us,' and I will look down and whisper, 'No.'" That line, that's page one literally page one of the or page 2, I guess, maybe, of the book. And yeah, throughout it's all identical. And including the detail, which is, he does it less in his journal, but more so in his speech in general, is he drops articles all the time. He doesn't use like a and the a lot. Like you'll notice when you're reading it, and in the movie, he'll very often not, his manner of speaking is very unique, and the movie copies that as well. But it's actually not as prominent in his journals. It is a little bit, but anyways.
Another Rorschach question. I have to know if this detail is from the book, because I feel like it is. Does he eat cold beans straight out of a can?
Yes. Yes. That exact thing happens. He shows up at Dan's apartment or house or whatever. And he's already there when Dan gets back, and he's just sitting in the kitchen eating cold beans out of a can. And Dan has the same thing where he's like, "Hey, do you want to warm those up?" And he's like, "No." Oh, and they even have a great little joke that where when he hands him the badge and there's like red stuff on it, Dan looks at it and he goes, "Is this bean juice?" And Rorschach says, "Human being juice." Great. It's great.
This is the point where we're going to talk about our content warning stuff.
Yes.
So we see a flashback to the past. And so the comedian was also in the original
He was in,
Minutemen
he's old enough that he
group.
was in both groups.
Yeah.
He was with the Minutemen and the Watchmen.
And one of the other vigilantes who was in this this first group was the original Silk Spectre.
Sally Jupiter.
Who is Laurie's mom. And we see the comedian like come on to her, and she kind of rebuffs him, and then he gets very
like,
angry,
beats her up and
assaults her, and he's going to rape her.
Yes.
And then another one of the
Hooded Justice.
Yeah, I wasn't sure who that guy was.
The movie never really goes into detail with him. His name's Hooded Justice.
Like walks in and is like, what the fuck?
Yeah, his name's Hooded Justice. He's actually at one point, I think at this time it was in a relationship with Sally, which again is never covered in the movie. And yeah, that's Hooded Justice. He comes in and beats him up. That scene is identical.
Okay.
Exactly the same. Plays out in this exact same manner where she's like going to change. He comes in, identical. And down to all the lines and everything like that. And yeah, it is a big that scene is a big inflection point eventually for like Laurie's backstory. Again, it plays out essentially identical. We'll get more into that later and kind of what it all means to Laurie's story and stuff like that.
Okay, so that leads me into my next question, which is like a general question about the structure of the graphic novel, because the movie kind of jumps around between timelines, more so at the beginning. It does it more. And we see like some more stuff with like the Minutemen and different things that happened at different points in history. Is the graphic novel structured similarly? Yeah,
absolutely. And honestly, even more so. But it does kind of follow that similar vibe or similar framework of there's more of it in the beginning. And then it kind of, once we get closer and closer to the conclusion, the last couple issues are a little more linear-ish, depending on if they include John or not. But yes, it is very much non-linear in that same way. We get a lot of, and we'll get to the very specific way that the Dr. Manhattan sections don't play out linearly. I have some specific notes about that I want to talk about because it was one of my favorite things. But the narrative in general bounces around between flashbacks and different periods in the Watchmen and the Minutemen's lives. And I honestly think the movie does a pretty good job at mimicking this overall. I do think the book just does it better. I think it's like just really well done, and it's really intuitive as it bounces around. There's a little bit here and there where you will be like, wait, okay, where are we now? But overall, it's very quick and easy to catch up and figure out what's going on. In particular, there's a transition. The transition into the scene where the comedian assaults Sally is identical in the movie, in the book, where she's looking at that old photograph and it zooms in and then it like the camera flashes and then we're in the past or whatever. That is exactly the transition you get in the graphic novel. And I have to add here, I'm going to do my best not to do this, but if I put every time that this movie perfectly recreates a page from the comic into this episode will be 5 hours long, and it's already going to be really long. So I'm going to do my best not to mention every single time that an image from the film is like an exact frame from the graphic novel. Suffice to say, it's a lot, which is a thing that I was talking to my friend Sam about this last night. He likes a lot of Zack Snyder's adaptations. He's a big comic book guy. Loves Watchmen. Big fan of all the DC stuff. And that was one of his favorite things about Zack Snyder, just in general, is it's like when you go into his movies, you are going to see the graphic novel you love put on the screen.
Yeah.
So
this specific line, I believe this was an exchange between the comedian and Night Owl.
Yes, it is.
I want to say.
Yeah.
And they're like breaking up a protest.
Yes, it is a protest against the heroes.
Yeah, it's an anti-vigilante.
Yeah.
Protest.
The police have just like quit. They're on strike basically because of the superheroes and the vigilantes and stuff. Yeah.
And Night Owl says, "What happened to the American dream?" And the comedian's like, "It came true. You're looking at it."
Yeah. Yeah, that's all word for word from the book. That whole scene is identical, essentially. It's a little bit shorter, but basically the same. The comedian is a horrible, horrible human being, but his whole deal is that he recognizes the world. Actually, pretty much everybody in this book, other than, like, I guess Night Owl to some extent, and Sally, and I guess you could say Dr. Manhattan's not a human being, so he's not really a horrible human being. He's just an indifferent, weird alien god. But pretty much everybody in this book is some level of a terrible person.
Yeah, I got that vibe.
Even Night Owl and Sally to some extent.
That vibe.
Really not Sally, to be fair. She's not. Or
Sally
Laurie.
or Laurie?
Laurie. Sorry, Laurie. Really not Laurie. honestly. She doesn't really have the same. I mean, other than the fact that they hang out with and pal around with terrible people, like that's Night Owl, in my opinion's biggest negative, is that he's friends with Rorschach, who's like a literal Nazi, basically. Not a Nazi, a literal like fascist weirdo.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they're all kind of terrible, but the comedian, like I said, he is horrible, but his whole deal is that he like recognizes the world for what it actually is, at least according to the universe of the Watchmen. That's kind of what they talk about in relation to him, is that he sees the world as it is, and that's why he has to laugh or whatever. That's why he's got to make jokes, because the world's so fucking awful. Also, earlier in this scene, the comedian has a line in the film where he says, "I ain't had this much fun since Woodward and Bernstein." And I thought that was a clever way to work in another thing that I'd mentioned earlier when you're asking about JFK. In the book, it is mentioned specifically that the comedian killed Woodward and Bernstein, like assassinated them, which were the two main journalists who broke the Watergate scandal. That's why Nixon
keeps getting reelected.
His Watergate never came to light because the comedian killed the journalists.
Okay.
Who were
that's fun. I feel like I wish that would. I guess it would have been harder to quickly show something like that.
Nobody knows what that. Yeah.
Yes, but that's something more like that I wish would have been included in the movie, because I find that way more interesting than he assassinated JFK.
Yeah, like I said, and that's that they kind of switched it to where there's an illusion in the movie that he assassinated Woodward and Bernstein, but they don't show it. But it's kind of the opposite. They don't show it in the book either, but it's very concretely explained that he did like kill those two journalists. But anyways, the movie at least references, and I thought that was kind of a clever way to incorporate that.
Another Rorschach voiceover question. He tells the story about the great clown Pagliacci, I believe is how it's pronounced, which really just hits different after X numbers of internet later. I had a very hard time taking him seriously.
Yes. Part of that, to be fair to the graphic novel specifically, part of that is because in the intervening years, we have had the Christian Bale Batman movies and stuff, and that voice has become such a meme that you can't really like take it seriously anymore. Which was the case when this movie came out, because this movie came out in 2009, and we had already had Batman Begins and stuff, so it was already kind of becoming a meme a little bit at that point. But they kind of had to do it that way because you just can't, when you look and read the stuff in the book, you can't imagine him speaking any other way. And he's also very clearly doing like a hard-boiled like noir detective kind of thing. So,
yes, absolutely.
Anyway, sorry, what was your...
The Pagliacci, does he tell that story in his journal?
Yeah, that whole scene is basically identical, where he goes to visit the comedian's grave and tells the story of Pagliacci, and then it's intercut with him visiting the grave in the rain and getting the flower, and then flashes of the comedian dying. That all plays out exactly identically, and I bet this is a lot of people's introduction to the Pagliacci story. I don't know. I had heard it outside of the context of Watchmen, but I do wonder, with this coming out in 85 or 86 or whatever, if a lot of people...
Right, that's what I'm saying. Like, probably not.
Yeah, probably most people had not, heard that kind of story.
But I've seen it memed to death now in 2023.
Yeah.
When he started in on that, I was like, for Christ's sake.
Yeah, that's the thing. A lot of the things in this, you have to remember, this is 86, so a lot of the this is a big cultural touchstone that a lot of other things have, pulled from and incorporated. So some of the stuff feels tired when in fact it wasn't when written.
Dr. Manhattan.
Yes.
Does he create copies of himself so he can work and fuck at the same time?
Absolutely he does. That's all identical. It's hilarious. That cracks me up every time I see it. But yes, it is identical, where she wakes up and there's like a bunch of blue hands holding up the book, rubbing her face.
Oh yes, and then I can see.
And she jumps out of bed.
Look at all that blue booty.
Yeah, there's multiple. It's the Manhattan Etoile. But yes, it does that exact thing, and she gets really upset about it because he's still working, but he's multitasking.
So she gets really mad about this and leaves. And then he sits on the bed And I really want to know, does he contemplate a bra?
Yes.
Because the looking at that scene made me laugh.
That's interesting.
Where he's
because
like sitting on the bed and like
Yeah.
thoughtfully staring at a bra.
It's interesting that you say that, because in the book that scene where that's happening is really worked for me. It was like incredibly like, I don't know, moving in a way. And I thought it worked okay in the movie, but it like really hit me in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And what we do is Laurie has run to Dan's at this point to go confide in Dan. And in the graphic novel, we keep cutting in between, like frame to frame, between her like talking and confiding in Dan, and then John like looking at her stuff, and including that shot in particular where he's like looking at her bra or whatever. And then right after that, he's like getting ready for an interview. He has the television interview that we see him in later. And the way it's intercut, I thought was just really compelling and inventive. And it happens constantly throughout this book, where we will intercut between characters in one scene will be talking about something, and then we will intercut to another character or something else somewhere else, and the two things will match up either tonally or narratively or in some way that is really interesting, to where they're interconnected without even being really connected, like in a way. It's really interesting. That scene in particular was like one of the first instances of it that really struck me. And again, I think the movie does it okay, but the book's version I thought really was effective in kind of showing the disconnect that has formed between Dr. Manhattan, John, and Laurie.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think it works better in the book. So
okay, so then we get Dr. Manhattan's backstory, and we find out like how he became a walking nuke, basically.
Yeah.
And there's a specific line in the movie that also made me laugh that maybe I shouldn't have made me laugh. I have brain worms.
No, it's supposed to make you laugh a little bit. No, it's absolutely supposed to be funny. I love this moment.
The specific line, a circulatory system was seen by the perimeter fence. And not even the image, just the line was what made me laugh.
Yeah. Yes, that is in the book. They change it slightly, and this is the one in particular that got me, because they include the next line, which is one of my favorite single little frames from this book that doesn't really matter, but it's just the caption and the image you see. But yeah, so what happens is it says, it's November 10th. Now there is a circulatory system walking through the kitchen. And then the next frame is November 14th. A partially muscled skeleton stands by the perimeter fence and screams for 30 seconds before vanishing, which I thought was a really creepy, cool.
Yeah.
Like, it's super cool, which they do that in the movie. And it says like they just have it be inside, I think. Like, he's like in a hallway, and they're like, November 14th in the hallway, a partially muscled skeleton stands in the hallway and screams for 30 seconds before vanishing. Again, they tweak it around again a bit, but it's essentially the same. And it is a little silly. Like, it's supposed to be a little funny, but it's also like really like the thought of it was very creepy to me. Like this just like skeleton popping up and just disappearing.
It's pretty horrifying.
Yeah.
I kind of wish the circulatory system would have been in the kitchen.
Yes.
In the movie. That's funnier.
Yeah. They also kept it. I read this. Apparently it's incorrect, because it's not just a circulatory system. It's like the nervous system and a few other organs as well. But they just kept it by saying circulatory system. Anyways, at least that's what I read on one thing, because there is a brain involved, and it looks like, I don't know. Anyways. But yeah, a partially muscled skeleton stands by the perimeter fence and screams for 30 seconds before vanishing. I thought it was like, that's a mood.
Oof, yeah. Okay, now I have to ask.
Of course, you have to.
I have to ask, how much blue penis do we see in this book?
Not zero. It's quite a bit. It's not as detailed as it is in the film. It's more so just like a little blue dangly thing. Like, we don't see, there's not a lot of shape to it in the book. And we don't see it nearly as much as we do in the film, to be honest. Like, it's in the film a lot more. A lot of times in the book, we like see him from behind or from the side, or it's framed where we don't see like below his waist or whatever. But he is naked basically all the time. he starts, and in the flashbacks, he actually starts with like a full like leotard costume and slowly starts trimming it down until he's just naked because he just doesn't see the point, basically.
Why would you need clothes when you're a nuclear blue man?
Yeah. He just
with a nuclear blue dong.
Yeah. But yeah, no, overall the look of Dr. Manhattan is like spot on to the book. Like it's truly like mind-blowing how close they were able to get his character design and like the way it glows in the film, I think really sells the whole like look and everything. It's basically spot on, and including the blue Dr. Manhattan penis. So
excellent.
Yep.
That's good to know.
Yep.
I can die satisfied now that I know that. Okay, so then the movie covers how John and Laurie got together.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote this tongue in cheek. I asked if she was a homewrecker.
Yeah.
Because he was like, he had like a long-term partner.
Is his partner, yeah.
Which I guess she's supposed to be young. I feel like she's still new, but
yeah. So yes, more than her being a homewrecker, obviously you wrote it tongue in cheek, is that John's kind of just a creep.
Well, right. Obviously, he should have known better.
Yes. And also in the movie, they changed the line to a very young girl looks at me and smiles, and which is good because in the book, she's specifically 16, not just young. She's like literally a teenager. And so, yeah, they do kind of attempt to explain that away. Not the 16 thing necessarily, but just that like him being with a young girl and like replacing her with a young girl is because of like John doesn't age. And they say this in the movie. I think he says this at one point. John doesn't age. And so like, he doesn't like the idea of being with people and watching them get older and die, like, because he doesn't get older and die, so he just replaces them with younger people over and over again. It would be the idea. I mean, we only see 2 instances of it. But yeah, it's not great. It's definitely some not ideal sexualization of young women in this, or young girls. They're girls. She's 16.
Oh yeah, a child.
Yeah.
Okay, so at one point, we see Rorschach visit Moloch,
I think.
Moloch.
I don't know how they pronounce it, but yeah.
Earlier, and we saw him go and visit with that guy, and then he goes back, and Moloch has been killed.
Yes.
Which he is then framed for, and like the SWAT team and everything descends on him.
They called the cops and sent him there to be framed for this murder.
And then he does the hairspray flamethrower thing.
Yes.
Does he do that in the comic book?
Yes.
Also, didn't they do that on Mythbusters?
I don't know if they did it on Mythbusters. I've seen every episode of Mythbusters multiple times. I'm sure at some point they did that, not as a myth, but like, I don't know what you're asking. What do you think they were testing on Mythbusters?
Like to see if it worked.
Oh, it works. I mean, I've done it before.
Well, I've never done it. Yeah. So I don't know. I've only seen it in movies and on TV.
Oh, no, there's nothing. It's just you're shooting a propellant through the air, an aerosolized propellant through the air into a flame. Yeah, it's going to burst into flames. And you got yourself a flamethrower. And so, yeah, he does do that in the book with, spray painter. I'm not sure exactly what it is. And it definitely works. I will say it's not like effective as a weapon apart from like scaring or surprising people. Sorry, it would be effective to normal people, but especially in this instance, it's like a SWAT team that is wearing like body armor and helmets and masks. Yeah. Not particularly effective against that because the flame is also not particularly good at like catching things on fire. Like it would need to be something very easily flammable so flamethrowers, like weaponized flamethrowers, don't just shoot fire. They shoot like a gel or a liquid or some sort of fuel that literally like coats the thing that you're shooting and then it keeps burning. So like, but this with like a flamethrower like this kind of like a homemade like hairspray flamethrower or whatever. You don't have anything it's literally just the flames hitting whatever the thing is. So unless that thing is exceptionally, flammable. It's not going to like burst into flames or anything like that. Yeah, if you got hit in the face with it, it would cause you issues and it might, damage your eyes and your skin and stuff. But again, I don't think it would be particularly effective other than like as surprising them in this scene, which is kind of how he uses it in the book. He basically does it and they're like, and they kind of like fall. And then he, another little detail that they did not include in the movie is that he pulls out his grappling gun and shoots one of the SWAT team guys in the chest at like point blank range with a grappling gun. It doesn't kill him. It says it just like just collapses his sternum or whatever, and he's in the hospital. But
I'm sure it would.
Yeah, but it's kind of played as like a fun little joke beat in the comic, which I thought was kind of funny. But yeah, he does do the flamethrower thing in the book, and then is able to kind of fight a few people off and jump out a window.
So he does get captured though. In the movie, and they unmask him, and he screams, "Give me back my face!" But in a more Rorschach-y way than I did it.
Give me back my face! Yeah.
Is that from the book?
Yes, basically identical. It jumps out of like the second story, lands in front of all the cops, and is trying to get up to get away, but he's kind of hurt from falling out of a second story window, and they're able to arrest him and grab him, and they pull his mask off, and he screams, "Give me my face," because he refers to it as his actual face.
As you do.
As you do. When you're a deeply traumatized crime fighter.
Speaking of deeply traumatized, we get some of his backstory then, like his origin story, which includes him as a child biting a guy's face off.
His cheek. Yeah.
Okay, part of his face. Cheek is still part of his face.
Right. Well, yes.
Is that from the book?
Yeah, it's right there.
Look at that.
Dumps down on it and rips his cheek off. Yeah. No, that exact scene plays out. He gets bullied by the local kids because his mom is a prostitute. And so he gets picked on for that a lot, which is a big part of his mom's also abusive, which we see at different times in the movie and in the book.
Does explain some of his views.
Oh yeah, no, his whole thing, and that's why he is the deeply horrible fascist that he is that, or part of the reason is that his mom was a prostitute who abused him and among other things, and like she was like worked around him all the time, so he saw it, and it was like deeply traumatizing for him as a kid, and then he was picked on by all these people for the fact because everybody knew that his mom was a prostitute, and so all of this trauma kind of piled on top of it until you get Rorschach, who's just who thinks all perverts should die, basically. And his definition of perverts is very broad.
It always is.
Yeah. Degenerates, I guess, is the word. Yeah.
So when he's in prison, then, and we establish that everyone in this prison hates him because he helped put people away. And I don't know if this is the origin of this line, or if this line this is the origin of this line.
No, absolutely the origin of this line.
Oh my god. Okay.
Yeah.
And he dumps fryer oil all over this guy whose skin starts crackling and frying.
Yeah.
And then he's like the guards are holding him and he's like, "I'm not locked in here with you." I can't even say it with a straight face. "You're locked in here with me."
Yeah. You don't get it. You're not locked in here with you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, my dude.
No, that's in the book. Although I will say this is a better in the movie moment, particularly because in the book we don't actually see him do it. We see that fight and him dump the oil all over the guy's face, which ultimately kills that guy a few days later. But we don't see him deliver that line. That line is relayed to us by the psychiatrist who is like studying the like report on what happened. And he's like late at night, like looking at his notes, and he's like, and then he's talking about like what happened, and he says so basically we see him reading the notes, and it's relayed to us that way. This line of him saying, "I'm not locked in here," or "You're not locked. I'm not locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me," or whatever. And so I think the movie actually having the character say it,
oh yeah, that's better.
Is a much more impactful moment than it would be if we like heard the psychiatrist reading his notes say it. So yeah, it is in the book. It's just, and he does say it. It's just we actually see it in the film, which I thought was a good choice, even if it is at this point, doesn't quite have the same impact that it
Yeah.
did when it came out.
So then we jump over to see what Laurie and Dan are up to,
Mhm.
and they've been kind of reminiscing about their vigilante glory days.
Yep.
And Laurie goes inside of Archimedes,
Mhm.
which again is the hovercraft.
Yeah, airship,
Thing,
whatever you want
airship.
to call it. Yeah.
It does kind of look like an owl.
Yeah, no, it is specifically designed to look like an owl.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And then she's kind of like fussing around in there, and she hits a button and activates a flamethrower and like sets the lair on fire.
Yeah.
And then he comes down and puts the fire out, and she's like, "Oh, I must have hit the wrong button." And I'm like, "Ma'am, it had a flame on it. What did you think it was gonna do?" Is that from the book?
Yes. So that exact scene happens in the book, although it's slightly different. And and I will say this is definitely better in the book because I don't know how it's very strange in the movie. I don't know why they changed it other than they didn't want this character to smoke. Maybe
That's probably it.
So because what happens in the book is she's down there looking around doing the same thing, but she's gonna smoke a cigarette.
As you do in 1985.
And she's looking at the council and she thinks that the flame thing is it's gonna like pop up like a lighter, like a you know, like in your car, like a cigarette lighter thing. So she thinks that is like the cigarette lighter button.
See, that makes sense.
Yes. So that's why she pushes it, and then it blows up. Yeah, but it all plays out the exact same after that. But yeah, she's trying to find a lighter basically, and that's what happens.
I mean, technically speaking, she did in fact find a lighter.
She did. She would just have to be standing in front of the vehicle, and she would have died. But yes, I also have to talk about her weird. And I guess this is like just an alternate universe thing. Unless this is a real thing that exists that I've just never seen or heard of.
I'm so excited to see what this is.
This weird cigarette thing that she has throughout the graphic novel that she smokes occasionally. And it looks kind of like a lollipop.
Okay.
And you see her at one point. So here's what it looks like on the top left there. That thing in her hand that looks kind of like a lollipop.
Yeah.
Where it's like a tube, like a cigarette, like a long cigarette, but then it's got like a round ball.
It almost looks like a bong.
Kind of, or like a crack pipe or something. Yeah. Or like it's kind of what it looks like. But you see at one point later, she actually fills it. And the way it works is she opens the little orb part and she unwraps like a like a tobacco ball basically, and like puts it in the ball part and then shuts it and then lights it somehow. So it's kind of like a pipe almost, like it's basically like a pipe, but just like a weird pipe and so I was like, I don't know if that's a real thing or if that's like something like a weird, you know, like I was like, is this just a weird smoking device that I have never seen before, or is this like an alternate universe, you know, thing?
Yeah, I don't know.
If anybody knows, I guess I could have looked it up.
Because I could see that being something that was like maybe around briefly.
Yeah, that just fell out of favor or whatever. And it's very interesting. And yeah, I'd never seen it before in anything, like movies, TV, nothing. And it made me assume that it's essentially like a made up thing. But it might not be. It might be a real thing. And maybe it's a made up thing. Maybe you literally couldn't. No, I don't think that's true. I think he could have had a cigarette in this. I think there are cigarettes at different points.
Yeah, I don't think that would have been an issue.
Yeah, it's not in 85. Because they were like obviously like the comics code and stuff way back in the day. But I have no idea. So if anybody knows the details on that cigarette thing, I would love to hear about. Yeah, there's a guy smoking a cigarette right there.
I assume that comedian has a cigar.
Yes.
In the book, because he has a cigar like always in the movie.
Yeah, he does.
One of those
at different
characters.
Times. Yeah, at different times he does have a cigar. So yeah, I don't know. I do not know what that is. Again, if anybody knows, let us know. I just thought it was interesting. It's not in the movie at all.
So a question about Night Owl. In the book, is his primary character trait his lust for Silk Spectre? Because I felt like it was in the movie.
Kind of. His primary character trait, I would say, is his lust for meaning and purpose, and that sort of he's like a lonely dude who
he's a sad boy.
Yeah, he's a sad boy who used to be a crime fighter and enjoyed doing that, and then it got outlawed, and now he can't do that anymore, and he doesn't really have a purpose.
Poor sad boy.
And so yeah, he's just kind of a lonely guy, and yeah, he has a crush on Lori, and when she shows up, their romance kindles, and she ends up liking him because he's like actually at least somewhat emotionally available, unlike John is. He's not super emotionally available, but he's at least somewhat emotionally available.
It wasn't a hard thing to achieve, I imagine.
To be an upgrade emotionally from Dr. Manhattan. Yeah, absolutely. And we will get into the impotence thing, which is a big recurring theme with his character, is that he's since no longer being able to fight crime, he's become impotent.
Oh.
That's like he can't.
Is that why they were having trouble that first time they were trying to have sex?
And that's why they are able to have sex after they go out and like stop the fire.
Now he can get a vigilante boner.
Yes, I have a specific note about it later that we'll get to. Okay. Well, I'll just say it now because it's relevant here. the scene when they go to that fire.
Yeah.
And save the people from the fire. In the book, she's just wearing her costume and she like walks down the stairs like all sexy, like in the film, sorry. Yeah. She like walks down the stairs all sexy and they get on it and they go out and they find that fire. In the book, she's wearing her costume under like an overcoat while they're like flying out to look for something to do. Like they're like, let's go, hey, let's take it out for a spin and find like a crime to fight or something. And they get there and they see the fire and they pull down next to the building to get into it. And as they're getting her, she's gonna go in and like get the people out. Mm-hmm. And as she does it, she pulls off her coat, revealing her outfit. And as this happens, the next frame is Archimedes' ramp extending out to the building. It literally gets a boner, like as she reveals her costume, because in this moment his impotence has been cured, and he just needed a little costume action, little role play,
Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that at all.
Speaking of that first scene where they try to have sex on the couch, though, I wanted to know if a specific shot was copied from the graphic novel, because I felt like I could visualize this in comic form, but there's a shot where they're on the couch and he has set his glasses like on the coffee table or whatever, and the camera is like looking through his glasses at them on the sofa.
Yeah. No, it's actually not. And I went back and looked at this. I didn't remember that shot in the film, but I figured that's what just from you describing it in the notes, I kind of envisioned what it was. And that does not happen in the book. What does happen is there is a shot of the TV screen reflected in his glasses sitting, like, because the TV's on still. And there's a shot of the TV screen reflected in his glasses as they're, and then the camera pushes into it, and then we pull out, and then we get the nightmare that we see where they're like standing on Mars
and their
or whatever.
Like, skin peels off.
So there is like a little bit of that with the glasses and using that as like a medium kind of, but no, that exact shot of like looking through the glasses and then having sex behind it is, or on the other side, is not in the graphic novel.
I would have put money.
No, yeah. Like I said, we do get a close up of the glasses, but it's the TV reflected in it and not them.
Interesting. So. At one point, while she's staying with him, I think she like wakes up in the middle of the night and goes down into his owl cave.
Yes.
Does it have a name?
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, Owl Cave is it?
Owl Cave, and he's standing like completely naked, just like staring at his night owl costume behind the glass. Is that from the book?
Yes, exactly. The exact frame, basically. Again, it's all the time that's the case. But yeah, no, that exact moment where he's just standing there naked. It's even funnier in the graphic novel because he's completely naked, other than he's wearing his night owl goggles.
Oh no.
Whereas in the movie, he's just naked. I think he's wearing his glasses. But yeah, in the graphic novel, he's wearing his night owl glasses and nothing else.
So they go to put out a fire, as you mentioned, when they decide they want to take Archimedes out for a spin. They're going to be vigilantes again, and they find this building on fire. And I'm just wanting some like clarification, or like I don't know how this works, because they're zooming down to this fire and she's like, the roof's gonna cave in, and then the solution to this is to shoot over the water reservoir that's on top of
tons of
like,
water.
and I understand the logic behind
Yeah.
Dump the water out,
Yeah.
but it feels like a bad idea if the roof's gonna cave in.
I would agree.
So is that in the book?
That is not how it goes down in the book. They added that. I don't know if somebody decided that they needed some gun shooting or something, because what happens in the book is they fly up and they're like, oh, the fire, we got to put it out. And he just has water jets on the, like.
See, that makes sense.
Little water cannons come out of the bottom and start spraying the building from the side, like a firefighter, basically. And yeah, because I had the same thought with the roof. But then also, they're in New York. They're in I think it's New York, right? Yeah, I'm fairly certain. Very populous city in the middle of the city. And this man's just spraying like anti-aircraft fire at a water tower with just. There's no way he didn't just kill like a couple dozen random people behind this building. Like it's so silly.
True.
It's so silly.
I also thought it was kind of funny in the book that all of the people that were still inside the building had conveniently gathered into one room.
Yeah, I don't think that I can't remember if they do. She
There's
kind of
like
runs
20
around.
people hanging out in this room.
We don't really see her part in it kind of cuts from my memory pretty quickly. Like she runs in and kind of escorts everybody over the walkway into the ship. And I don't think we really see how she gets to everybody. But anyways.
So they rescue those people and then they go down to Pound Town inside Archimedes. And as she's orgasming, she hits the fire button again, and there's like a fire blast as she orgasms.
Yep.
Is that from the book?
Absolutely. It's great. I love subtle symbolism. But yes, that exact moment happens in the graphic novel. After the fire, they go up and they have sex, and he's able to have sex now because he's all fired up from the literally fired up from the fire. And as soon as the movie makes it more clear that she's climaxing in that moment, whereas in the graphic novel, it's more so like he like lifts her up onto the console while they're having sex and her like butt hits it or something, and like, but same idea. And yeah, you get the shot of the flames come shooting out, and yep,
Nice.
Yep.
So then we pop back to prison. Catch up with Rorschach again. And there's a prison riot happening because apparently everyone loved that guy that he killed.
Yeah, I will say I had a note about this. I was like, I don't know why that one prisoner was so important.
He was the linchpin upon which the entire prison system
I didn't understand it in the graphic novel or the movie. Like, I think there's a one or two lines like kind of mentioning that like he's popular or like a leader of something maybe. But as soon as he dies, the entire prison goes up in a giant riot.
Yeah. So then there's this particular guy who I got the vibe was like some kind of mafia guy.
I don't think we ever know his backstory. He was a criminal of some sort that Rorschach busted.
Right.
His name's Big Figure. Because he says big figure, small world, which is what he says in the movie too. Or in the book and the movie. Yes, Big Figure.
Rorschach is still in his cell, and this guy and his two like giant goons want to get him out of his cell. But he pulls one of the goons' arms through the bars.
And, the guy tries to grab him, and then he ties
his arms up. And so they then saw that guy's arms off so that they can get to the door.
Yeah.
Do they saw a guy's arms off in the book?
No, and this is better in the movie by far, in my opinion, because this scene makes no sense in the graphic novel, in my opinion, unless somebody else can explain to me why they would do this. In the exact same thing happens in the graphic novel. He reaches through to try to strangle him or whatever. He grabs him, breaks his fingers, and like ties his hands together. And the same thing happens, but where they're like, well, sorry, we got to get to him. You're expendable. But in the graphic novel, they just slit his throat, and he just like slumps over dead, but still tied.
He would still be covering the door.
He's still exactly. And so I do not remotely understand what purpose
makes way more
killing him serves in the book. Whereas in the movie, it makes perfect sense. He's in the way, cut his arms off.
Sure.
It still kills him, but he's out of the way now. I truly do not understand what that scene was what was happening there in the book. Again, it felt like a thing where he was trying to like show, you know, how ruthless this big figure is, and like how adamantly he wants to get to Rorschach, but it doesn't really make sense. Whereas the movie's version makes at least a little bit more sense.
Yeah.
So.
But then Night Owl and Laurie show up to bust Rorschach out of prison. But then he's like, I got one thing I have to do first, or whatever he says. That's something very edgy, I'm sure.
I think he just says I gotta like use the restroom.
And he follows Big Figure into the bathroom, and this is another place where I was like, oh, I could see this as a panel of comic strip. Where he follows him in, and then the bathroom door is like swinging, and it swings a little bit less each time, and then he leaves, and you see like the blood start to trickle out from under the door.
Yeah.
Is that in the book?
It's not. Not exactly. I mean, that scene is in the book, and I will say this is better in the movie for me, because I actually didn't realize upon reading what was happening there. So he says in the graphic novel, and I assume it's the same in the movie because all the lines are the same. He says, "Excuse me, I have to visit the men's room." And then you see him walk into the men's room, and then he comes back out, and then you see water coming from the men's room.
Oh.
I didn't realize on the page before there's one frame of Big Figure running into the bathroom.
Oh.
And I don't know if I just glazed over it or didn't realize what it was, because that's the only time you see it, and you don't see Rorschach's not even in the frame when it happens. He is chasing him, but in the scene where he goes into the bathroom, Rorschach's not in the frame, but then he is later. And then then he goes in there. I really liked the movie's version of that. I thought it made it clearer to me what was happening. And in the I think it's supposed to be blood in the graphic novel, but the lighting and the coloring makes it hard to tell.
It's hard to tell. It's some kind of liquid, but it's hard to tell exactly what it is.
Yeah, to me it just looks like water, and then maybe with some blood. But again, the lighting is very intense in this. It's all like orange and yellows because it's like there's fires and stuff or whatever, so it's hard to tell what's happening. So I'd have thought the movie's version of that was a little more effective because I could actually tell what was what was transpiring there.
So then John shows back up briefly and VoIPs Laurie to Mars with him.
Mm-hmm.
He's been on Mars.
Yes.
And she almost dies on Mars because he briefly forgets that she needs to breathe.
Yeah.
Is that from the book?
Yes, and I love that detail. It's great. It actually is a little bit longer. It takes him longer to realize in the book than it does in the movie. He pretty quickly in the movie is like, oh, that's right, and like creates like a force field of air for her or whatever. But in the book, she like starts suffocating and he doesn't realize, and she starts falling down like a hill because she's like, and then he finally realizes like, oh, that's right, I'm sorry, these things slip my mind. and then but yeah, the exact same thing happens, which again, it's a great little detail showing where John's priorities are.
Isn't it also really cold on Mars?
Yeah. Yes, I think, or really hot depending on the time of day. I think it's cold, but yeah.
Oof, okay. So we're getting close to the end of the movie. This is the point where I started trying to guess what the super big change that everyone hated was. And
I don't even know if everybody hates it, to be fair. I think it's just controversial, but anyways.
And my first guess was that maybe in the comic, Ozymandias was not secretly the bad guy mastermind. So is he secretly the bad guy mastermind in the book?
Yes, and we will have more on that. But yes, that is not the big change. He is the exact same thing. He is the big secret mastermind who has been planning this whole thing, and has put this whole plot into motion. But yes, we will expand on this in great detail in Lost in Adaptation, because you have a question there that is more relevant for explaining what is going on here.
Is there a smiley face on Mars?
Yes, absolutely. And that's real.
That's real?
That's real in real life. That's not just a thing in the comic. It is a real landmark on Mars called Gall Crater, and it's named after Johann Gottfried Gall. So apparently the crater was used in the graphic novel when Gibbons just the artist stumbled, Dave Gibbons stumbled across, saw this crater somehow, and was like, oh my gosh, there's this crater that looks like a smiley face, and we're doing this whole smiley face thing throughout our
that's pretty perfect.
Yeah. And so he was like, and this is the quote, he said, the similarity was almost too good to be true. I worried that if we put it in, people would never believe it. And so, yeah,
I get that.
Yeah, but no, it's absolutely, and it's just pareidolia. Like if you look at the actual thing, it doesn't look quite as much like a smiley face. Like if you go look at a picture of the actual crater on Mars, it looks like a smiley face, but it's not quite as
like perfect
as it looks in the movie, in the graphic novel.
Okay, so we're in our final battle with Ozymandias. Does he kill his own cat? For nothing.
Bubastis.
For nothing. Because it doesn't even kill Dr. Manhattan.
Unfortunately, yes. So Ozymandias thinks that this is his only chance to destroy John. And so he goes down to the basement, or to this area where this tachyon field generator thing is, which is the same kind of thing that turned John into the superhuman god thing that he is. And Bubastis, who is the Lynx, which we'll talk about more later, just kind of wanders into the danger zone. And Ozymandias doesn't want to risk alerting John to his plan. So he says the same thing in the movie where he's just like, I'm sorry, girl, or whatever. And then fries him because he doesn't want to, like, again, risk alerting John to what's going on. So he just like, Boop. And I also, it reiterates the idea that Ozymandias will just sacrifice pretty much anything to achieve the goals that he has of like world unification, world peace. Bubastis is like his only companion. Yeah. Basically. There's some other people that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but essentially it's like his main companion. And again, reiterating that he is willing to give up whatever to kind of achieve this dream he has of world unification.
Okay. Does Dr. Manhattan explode Rorschach and then fuck off to another galaxy to become a god?
Yes, this is exactly what happens. Apart from some things that we'll talk about shortly, in terms of what all happens there at the end. There's a slight change in the scene where he does blow up Rorschach that I like and dislike. In the book, it's just Dr. Manhattan and Rorschach and when this all goes down. In the movie, they have Night Owl come out and be there, which I like that change. I think having him be there as a witness, because him and Rorschach are like the only people that have like, he's like Rorschach's only friend, quote unquote. Right. And they actually have like this weird, strange relationship. But I like that he's there, but I feel like his reaction in the movie is a little like Vader at the end of Revenge of the Sith.
It's a little corny.
No! And he like drops to his knees, and it's a little like, I wish they would have played it slightly differently, but I do like having him there. It's just, so yeah. But that is essentially exactly what happens, because Rorschach's like, I'm not gonna lie, it's no half measure, or not half measures, whatever he says, never compromise or whatever. He's a very, which we'll talk about too, he's a very black and white morality kind of guy. And so he won't go along with the lie. So Dr. Manhattan has to vaporize him.
Rip.
Yep. Or fuck off. A little bit of both. Mostly the fuck off.
All right. So does this story end with a journalist finding Rorschach's journal and implying that everyone is going to know what happened regardless?
Yes and no. So let's briefly talk about the New Frontiersman, which the movie almost entirely omits, other than showing us at the end there. We do see Rorschach drop the book earlier. We see it like go through a mail slot or whatever. But again, we have no context on what this newspaper is or anything like that. We'll talk more about this very briefly, I think, here a little bit later. Wait, hold on. Let me double check that I do have a note to talk about the New Frontiersman later. I think I do. Well, maybe not. So we're just going to talk about it now, and if I have a note about it later, won't talk about it then. So in that moment, so what the New Frontiersman is it's essentially like a Nazi, like alt-right newspaper.
Okay.
And we see them several times throughout the course of the book, and they're just straight up, like, again, like a far right super extremist. At one point, they print an article called "The United States of America." Like they're very much just
okay.
And I do have a note about this later, so we'll get into it a little bit more. I am remembering now. We'll get into it a little bit more here in a bit. But yeah, they're like a far right newspaper. Who is supportive of superheroes mainly because they like Rorschach and other people because they're the whole like stamping out crime, blah, 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 whatever. So I do not like in the movie that they just they lean way more in to the direction that the paper is definitely going to print his journal. In the book, what happens is the same thing at the end. Like they're like, hey, we need to fill some space in the next issue of the newspaper or the magazine or whatever. Just get something out of the kook drawer or whatever they call it. Because they'd gotten this notebook earlier, but they're like, they read like the first line of it, which is the first line of this book, which is the dog carcass in alley this morning, tire tread on burst stomach. This city is afraid of me, and I've seen its true face. And they're like, what is this nonsense? And they throw it in in like their crazy person drawer. But later we see that same like stack of files at the end where they have all these random stuff. And his notebook is like halfway down this stack of stuff. And the editor says the same thing. He's like, find something to print out of that thing. And the same kid walks up to it and kind of looks at it. But we don't, it's implied that like, it still might come out. But the movie like makes it obvious that is what happened, because apart from it being on top of that pile, like the most prominent thing we can see, we also then hear Rorschach's VO from the beginning. Yeah. Which to me implies they're printing it.
Yeah, I would think.
Yes. And so I don't like that the movie doesn't leave it as ambiguous. I like that the graphic novel's like, there's some tension left there of like, are they going to print it? Probably, eventually. We don't know, but we don't know. Whereas the movie's like, yeah, it's happening. And I'm like, I don't know. I prefer the book's version a little bit, so. But that is essentially, basically the same thing that happens. All right, lots of questions there. We have even more in Lost in Adaptation.
Just show me the way to get out of here, and I'll be on my way.
Was it lost?
Yes, and I want to get unlost as soon as possible.
Okay, so we talked about the opening credits montage that gives us a lot of like the background story. So I was curious if all of that stuff was kind of similarly like skimmed over in the graphic novel, or if it gets expanded upon more.
It gets expanded upon more. As I said earlier, I thought it was a pretty clever way to incorporate it into the movie. Much of what we see in those opening credits is expanded upon in greater detail throughout flashbacks and memories and other stuff like that. But then also very specifically, the supplemental material, every chapter, issue, whatever. So the book, if you're reading Watchmen as a collection now, is 12 chapters, which were released as individual issues when they were printed. At the end of each one of those, other than the 12th one, doesn't have it, but the 1 through 11, they have like an attached supplemental material thing, which is like a what's the epistolary style, like documents from the world of Watchmen. I have a note about this later. We'll talk about like what some of those are and better in the book. But a lot of what happens in that opening credit thing is explained in the end of chapter 2's supplemental material. There's like Hollis Mason who is the original Night Owl, wrote a autobiography called Under the Hood, which is referenced in the movie.
We do see him with that book, yeah.
And we the first, I think, 3 issues all end with excerpts from that, and then after that, each one time, like the supplemental stuff is different. And in the second one, we get a lot of backstory about like the Minutemen, and that's where we find out what happened to Silhouette and all that sort of stuff, which is a lot of the stuff that we see in that opening credit sequence. Yeah. And again, I thought it was a fairly clever and effective way of kind of getting that background information quickly. I would imagine for non-book readers, it would be tough to digest. all of what was being thrown at you to some extent, but
I got the gist of it.
Yeah.
There were a couple things that I missed because it was going fast in a few places.
Yeah.
And I think the main thing that was detrimental to me for that opening montage was not knowing who any of the characters were.
Yeah.
Like, especially the Minutemen, because sometimes they would show just like a brief flash of something, and I'd be like, I don't even know who that is.
Yeah. I'll expand on a few of those people in a little bit here. In particular, I got to talk about Banknote, I think is his name. I can't remember. He's my favorite. He's the guy who you see a brief flash in the opening credits of a superhero like laying against like revolving doors with a bunch of bullet holes in them.
Yeah.
We'll talk about what happened there. It's great.
All right. Okay, my next big question. What exactly are Dr. Manhattan's powers? Because it feels like it's whatever's convenient to the narrative at the moment.
So it's a little bit of that. The book never goes into explicit detail. There is the supplemental material at the end of the Dr. Manhattan backstory issue, I believe has a little bit about him. There's a Dr. Manhattan superpowers and the superpowers. It actually doesn't really go into specific detail about like what his powers are. It's more so about like
because we see him do a lot of different things in the movie. He teleports people and he can see the future and like all kinds of stuff.
If I had to sum it up, I would say that he, again, without having like combed through the Wikipedia page, to see like what it lists all his powers as, I would sum it up as he is able to control like atomic things on like an atomic level, like or like on a subatomic level, basically, which basically gives him unlimited superpowers. I was
gonna say, then he can do like anything.
He can almost do anything. He can teleport because he can move himself, like he can move things through time and space however he wants. He can rip things apart and make them float around because he can control like the tachyon fields and stuff. I will say he doesn't see the future per se, and I don't know how clear this was in the movie. But it's more so he experiences time non-linearly. And the best analogy I have for this is imagine the aliens from Arrival.
Right.
Where he's kind of experiencing all moments in time simultaneously. And that kind of roughly works out to a form of precognition where he knows the future because he has already experienced it, kind of thing. Again, think Arrival.
Right. No, I understand, like... I understand how the aliens from Arrival worked. Yeah. That was not clear to me at all watching the movie.
Yes. So it's very clear in the book, and he explains it numerous times. And one of my favorite elements or sort of instances of how it plays out is a scene that we do not get, or is elements of a scene that we do not get in the movie. And I want to talk about it because I love it so much. And that is the whole scene on... Mars, where him and Laurie have their big conversation. That is like a whole issue or whole chapter of the book, basically. And the way that chapter starts is we see a bottle of perfume tumbling through space. It's the first thing we see, and then we actually go back in time because the last chapter ended with Laurie and Dr. Manhattan teleporting to Mars. Then we go back in time and see that happen again from Laurie's perspective, whereas before we kind of saw it from like Dan's perspective. And then we get to Mars and they have their whole conversation, the part where she's suffocating and stuff. But we see the perfume bottle tumbling through space first. And what's happening there is... And I caught this as I was reading it, and I was like, that's cool, is that we're seeing that event doesn't happen until the end of the chapter. She actually throws her bottle of perfume. It's the last thing she does. So in the book, or in the film, when she figures out that the comedian is her father and she gets really upset about it, she runs over and she punches his fortress and destroys it. At the end of this chapter, when she figures that out, she's like throwing all of the stuff out of her purse because she's like, if none of this matters, what, Earth, nothing matters to you. What is, because she's like she's just like having I say a tantrum, but she's just like very upset and is like throwing all stuff out of her purse. And when she finally realizes that the comedian is her father, she pulls the perfume out and chucks it. And so that's the perfume flying through space. And so we're actually, and that this whole chapter does stuff like that, where you kind of, and all of John's chapters do, where events don't happen in order that they happen necessarily. And it's really interesting. It's really cool. I like it a lot. And this scene is one really cool example of it that I wish they had figured out a way to do in the movie. We'll talk more about some other elements where they kind of capture it a little bit, mainly in the whole John backstory scene. But yeah, sorry, what was your question? I don't remember what was your initial? I'm trying to remember where.
I was asking what his powers were.
Yeah, no, I remember that.
Basically answered.
I remember that part, but there was something specific that I was trying to address. Oh yeah, and so basically, yeah, his power, his ability to experience time simultaneously, all time simultaneously, which he actually explicitly explains this to Laurie in that scene in the book, which I don't think he does in the movie. And yeah, so it basically gives him a form of precognition. He doesn't really know. It's similar to Arrival. It's not like he can be like clearly predict the future necessarily. As just he knows certain things that are happening because that are gonna happen because they already did to him. Basically. And not just to him. He explains it as time is all time is always happening, always everywhere, but that humans just can't perceive it, basically. Like, we perceive time from one specific angle.
Right.
Looking at it one way, when in reality, all time is happening always everywhere. But humans can't see that. And so.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And we'll talk more about that when we get in just a second.
All right. Though that leads me into my next question, though, which was that I feel like this is what I wrote down. I feel like I don't understand what anyone's powers are other than Dr. Manhattan, whose powers seem to be whatever he wants.
Yes. So Dr. Manhattan's powers are, like we said, pretty much whatever he wants. He's just all powerful. He's basically a god. In the book, the only person who I got the vibe has actual powers other than Dr. Manhattan is Ozymandias. And that's really only from the single moment at the end of the book where he catches a bullet.
Yeah.
Everyone else is just normal humans that are in like really good shape and have mastered martial arts and stuff. The movie plays with this a bit more in a way that I think is confusing. For instance, in the beginning, we see the comedian like literally punch through like a fireplace, he like punches at the guy and like takes a chunk out of like a brick wall.
Yeah.
And from my understanding, the comedian is not a superhuman. Nobody is a superhuman except for Dr. Manhattan. And I think Ozymandias also does some things in the movie specifically that kind of border on like superpowers. There's a scene where the assassin shows up and he kind of like super speedily like moves around everybody and avoids getting shot and some other stuff like that. And then later in the fight scenes at the end, he's doing some stuff that I think kind of border on having superpowers. I think you can kind of headcanon his abilities in the film, at least, to being derived from some sort of tech that he created. He's like this super genius billionaire who has all kinds of amazing technology. And again, that he has this like circlet thing. I kind of just headcanon that's giving him like advanced, hyper abilities or something like that. That's never addressed in the book. And he doesn't seem to have powers like that as much in the book, other than, again, he does catch a bullet at the end.
Right.
But the book is never clear whether or not that's a superpower, if he just kind of got like, he's like super highly trained and got kind of lucky or whatever. That being said, even in the comic, all the characters kind of have that like generic Batman power level where they're supposed to just be humans, but no human, regardless of how much they trained or whatever, could do some of the stuff that like Batman does.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's that kind of thing.
Yeah, it was interesting to me because it felt like watching the movie, it seemed like everyone at least had like somewhat enhanced like strength and resilience.
They're not supposed to. Well, again, it just, everything I could find when I was reading about this, it just says like they're in peak physical form or whatever.
Yeah.
but they do things that are like slightly above even peak physical form. You know, they're not doing things that like gymnasts can do. They're doing things that like superheroes do.
Right.
And so again, I think it just kind of falls into the same thing. Like Batman is not supposed to have any superpowers, but he does stuff even still that, you know, people couldn't actually do.
Yeah, it is interesting to me though, because I do feel like superhero movies as a genre tend to be so focused on like origin stories and like exploring like what people's powers are and how they got their powers, and then this movie was just like, you know what, we're just not going to tell you.
Yeah, well, it's because Alan Moore does not care. That is not what he's interested in. He does not like, from everything I've heard, he does not particularly like superheroes. I mean, clearly he wrote this book, which is about how much superheroes suck for the most part. So yeah, I think, he's not concerned with like power levels or who has what abilities necessarily. The powers are in a means to tell the story, or the lack of powers or whatever, and just the character. He's interested in the characters and the way they interact with the world that he's created, and you know, whether or not they're slightly stronger than a real human is not really of that much import.
Okay, why does everyone seem to think that Dr. Manhattan was giving people cancer on purpose? That was the vibe I got.
Okay. I will say that this is definitely not the implication in the book, and I don't think that's what they're going for in the movie. So in the book, and kind of what I got the same thing in the movie. It's more of a thing of just, hey, everyone around you has gotten cancer. Did you know that was happening? Did you know you caused cancer? You're like a literal god. How did you not know you were giving people cancer? That sort of thing. Not like, you're giving people cancer on purpose, aren't you? Like, that's not what they're saying.
Like, to me, it had a vibe of like, hey, all of your friends have gotten cancer from you. What do you have to say for yourself?
Well, that is it. It is what you have to say for yourself, but it's not, are you giving them cancer on purpose? It's, you know, did you know you caused cancer, or, you know, that kind of thing. Like,
but then also, like, it seems very obvious to me, like, of course, a radioactive man would give people cancer if they're around him long
you keep
enough.
calling him nuclear and stuff.
Whatever.
He's not actually that. His energy fields were like defibrillated by a tachyon field generator or whatever. He basically was like deconstructed at an atomic level. He's not just like nuclear powered.
Okay.
I'm just saying.
Science babble.
It is. It's complete, you know, it's complete science jargon babble nonsense. I'm just saying it's not, there is no, he is not like, he didn't like get hit by, he's not the Hulk. He didn't get hit by gamma radiation or whatever. Like, that's not what happened. He got his complete molecular structure destabilized by some sort of tachyon ray or something.
Okay.
Slight difference. Again,
well,
I have to specify.
I'm just saying that it seems like a very obvious leap.
It would seem like something you would at least check.
Like, it feels like something that they would have thought of at some point. Like, hey, maybe we should make sure.
There's almost no way he wasn't. He worked at like explicitly in like military bases and stuff. There's almost no way, like, because him and Laurie are like living at a military base.
Right.
There's like 0% chance he wasn't around a Geiger counter like ever. So I think they would know. And again, ultimately we find out he was not.
Right. He was not giving them cancer. But then I also thought it was funny later on when Night Owl was like to Laurie was like, well, you don't have cancer. And I was like, that we know of.
Well, in the book, they do explicitly say she gets a bunch of tests done after he leaves from Mars, and she runs off to Dan's. She shows up at Dan's later or whatever, and they're like, "Oh, I got the test back. I don't have cancer." So,
okay. Now, speaking of Dr. Manhattan, what is it exactly that he's supposed to be building on Mars? Because that scene just reminded me of the scene from Frozen when Elsa runs away and builds an ice castle.
Yes, it's pretty much that. Pretty much.
And I really need to know if anyone has ever set that scene to let it go.
Probably.
I need that in my life.
I'm sure we'll have to look. I'm sure it exists. But yeah, pretty much he runs to Mars after the cancer thing because he's just like, well, if I'm that much of a problem, I'm out of here. And he creates his own little fortress of solitude on Mars. Also, it sets up a great set piece for the conversation with Laurie at the end. Also, kind of delving a little bit deeper, I think what we're going for here symbolically is it's symbolic of like the comfortable fantasies that we create for ourselves, I think is kind of the idea. So John runs to Mars to get away from his problems on Earth. Laurie shows up later. She's denying the truth of her parentage. And when she finally comes to terms with that, she destroys this fortress. And it crumbles just as her comfortable fantasy about the comedian and her parentage and who her actual father is crumbles. And John's comfortable fantasy that he can just not care and run off to Mars and say, fuck it, crumbles in that same moment, and they go back to Earth. So it's again, I think it's just, it's his own fantasy, comfortable fantasy world that he has created to go hide in. And it comes crumbling down when Laurie shows up and they hash things out.
So it is the ice castle from Frozen.
Yeah. Yes. Also, the look of it is spot on from the graphic novel. Not only spot on, but like the whole scene where he builds it and everything is like identical with his naked blue butt floating in space.
Oh yeah, look at that.
I mean, it just rises right out of the
look at him float on Mars.
Yeah. And he gets his giant Mars fortress. Yeah.
Good for him.
Yep.
Okay, I have to ask about Ozymandias's tiger lynx.
The lynx.
Lynx. Because this really threw me for a loop. Because up until that very specific moment when we saw this cat, I felt like I understood the world that the movie had created. I was like, okay, it's obviously a fantasy, but like, it feels grounded.
Alternate Earth reality.
It feels grounded in some kind of reality, and like I understand the world. And then all of a sudden, the movie was like, and here's Battle Cat.
Yeah, that's Bubastis. Her name is Bubastis. So it's pretty simple. It's just that Veidt had been experimenting with genetic engineering, and Bubastis was the result. Bubastis is a genetically altered lynx. He was doing experiments on genetics and made Bubastis. As I mentioned earlier, also like his main companion and bestie. Also in the book, Bubastis is red and black. And in the film, she's kind of like a bluish, grayish, purpley and black color. I thought the red and black was cooler. I wish they would have stuck with that. I also made it more obviously like a weird like creation to me. Like if it's like this, because it's like bright red and black. It's not like a tiger orangey red black. It's like red. But yeah, I love Bubastis. I was sad when Bubastis got fried. It's also kind of hearkening to the classic like villain with the cat,
right?
On their lap kind of thing.
Yeah.
Also, he's big into Egyptian symbolism and stuff like that.
I got that.
Yep.
I got that.
Yep. No, I know. I'm just saying for audience and stuff. Yeah.
The movie made that abundantly clear.
Yes. More so than the book. I mean, it's in the book a lot, but he doesn't stand in front of like, giant Egypt. Like his throne room at the end is not like a giant Egyptian temple or whatever. So, yeah. Well, it is to some extent. That's a lie, but it's just not as on the nose as the book anyway, or as the film. Anyways.
Okay. So my biggest question. I alluded to this in my summary.
It's gonna take a lot of explaining. Just a heads up.
Okay, so John and Laurie are on Mars.
Yeah.
And they're arguing, and Laurie's like, I don't understand your perspective. Help me see it from your perspective. And then he like does his little magic hand thing and touches her brain.
Yeah. That's not a thing in the book, by the way.
And she sees like a flashback of like her mom and finds out that the comedian is her dad. And then first off, I don't understand how that constitutes seeing things from Dr. Manhattan's perspective. Secondly, I don't understand why that makes him want to save the world.
Okay. I will do my best to explain this. It's this maybe the biggest failing of the movie to some extent, because it's an incredibly important scene to the overall everything that's going on. And I think it was handled incredibly clumsily in the film. So what actually happens in the book is that Laurie and John are having their argument about whether or not he should save Earth. And during the course of this conversation, they start discussing earlier events from their life together. And like at one point he asks her like, what's your earliest memory? And she has this memory of a snow globe and looking at this snow globe. And that is during the moment when her mom and who she thought was her dad were arguing.
Mm-hmm.
And she hears that part of the conversation about like, oh, it was only one time or blah, 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 something like that. Then they also have this thing where they go back to, there's another memory that she has of her and John at like a dinner banquet, like a Minuteman or I guess a Watchmen dinner banquet thing together. And the comedian is there and she throws a drink in his face. And then there's also the memory of her like walking out of the one of the Watchmen meetings. I think the first one where the comedian comes up and is talking to her.
Yeah.
And he's like, what, can a guy have a conversation with an old friend's daughter or something like that? And Sally comes up and like shuffles her off and she's like, get out of here, blah, blah, blah. And so ultimately this all kind of spirals into Laurie thinking of all these things from her past, quote unquote, seeing things the way John does. Because one of the things he says, he's like, look, you want me to look at things from your perspective, like your emotional human perspective, but you don't look at things from my perspective, which is, and his perspective is seeing all things at all times, always, because he's a weird alien god who perceives time non-linearly. And so when she starts kind of flashing around to all these memories, and it's sort of quick. Again, it's hard to explain without just reading it. We keep flashing between all these different scenes, and it keeps amplifying and escalating through all these old memories. And again, none of this is John like touching her forehead and like zapping her into this realization or whatever. And so, yeah, she starts seeing things the way John does, which is to say all points in time simultaneously. And she starts piecing together these different moments from her life. And then it all just sort of locks into place. And she realizes that the comedian was her father, but that she had been blocking this knowledge out. At one point, John perceives this, and he's kind of, because he says to her, she's like avoiding something. And at some point during their conversation, he like coaxes her into the revelation that this is the case. Again, she starts seeing things again from John's perspective because she's remembering all these different moments of her life all at once. And when she does that, she's able to put together the fact that the comedian is her father.
Okay.
This whole conversation just is way better in the book. This whole Mars conversation. I mentioned the part about the perfume bottle and stuff, that when she does realize it, she throws the perfume bottle and this is what shatters the fortress, which is way more compelling than running over and like punching it. In particular, the perfume bottle is also it's Veit's perfume bottle line. It's the nostalgia thing. On top of that, we get the nonlinear part where we're seeing events from later in the chapter earlier. Blah, 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 blah. Getting to your other question, though, of why does this make John decide I should go save Earth? The reason he thinks that, and this is the intro quote that or a part of it is from the intro quote that I read. Basically, once she realizes that, and he realizes it in the same moment, it makes him remember the like beauty, and I'll just read it because I'm trying to do it justice, I think, without just it's not that long. So she figures out that she throws the bottle, destroys the fortress because she's figured out she's the comedian's daughter. And he says, Laurie, are you all right? Of course not. Blake, that bastard, and my mother, they pulled a gag on me is what they did. My whole life's a joke. One big, stupid, meaningless, oh shit. And then John says, I don't think your life's meaningless. Oh no? Well, obviously that's what you're going to say because anything I'm stupid enough to believe is true. You just disagree with it and, you don't? No, but listen, you've just been saying life is meaningless, so how can I change my mind? But why? Thermodynamic miracles. Events with odds against so astronomical they're effectively impossible. Like oxygen spontaneously becoming gold. I long to observe such a thing. And yet, in each human coupling, 1,000 million sperm vie for a single egg. Multiply those odds by countless generations against the odds of your ancestors being alive, meeting, siring this precise son, that exact daughter. Until your mother loves a man she has every reason to hate, and of that union, of the 1,000 of million children competing for fertilization, it was you, only you, that emerged. To distill so specific a form from that chaos of improbability like turning air into gold. That is the crowning unlikelihood, the thermodynamic miracle. But if that's a thermodynamic miracle, I mean, you could say that about anybody in the world. Yes, anybody in the world. But the world is so full of people, so crowded with these miracles that they become commonplace and we forget. I forget. We gaze continually at the world and it grows dull in our perceptions, yet seen from another angle, from another's vantage point, as if new, it may still take the breath away. Come, dry your eyes, for you are life, rarer than a quark and unpredictable beyond the dreams of Heisenberg, the clay in which the forces that shape all things leave the fingerprints most clearly. Dry your eyes and let's go home. So basically, he sees.
That's nice.
Yes, it's my favorite part of the book. It's why I made it. It's my absolute favorite part of the book. Yes. So it's the same thing. Yeah, he sees the value in her and the miracle of her existence.
Mm-hmm.
Again, in this long line of humans that have existed. And he goes, when we look at Earth, that becomes commonplace. We forget that miracle. I forgot that miracle of what humanity can be, what it is. It is worth saving, basically. Roughly.
I did not get any of that from the movie.
Really? Because I did. But then again, I already had read that scene. Because the movie, almost word for word, keeps most of that in that scene where they're having that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think they trim a little bit here and there, but it's very similar. But it's also possible that you just didn't, for whatever reason. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But no, it's like I said, it's my favorite part of the whole book. I absolutely love it. Okay,
one last question. I just want to make sure that I have this right. So what happened in the end is that Ozymandias nuked a bunch of cities to frame Dr. Manhattan so that everyone on Earth would band together against him.
Back to back here.
Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay.
That is what happens in the movie. Sorry, I need to take another breath because I got to talk for about 5 hours. This is the big change. So apart from cutting some things out, trimming things here and there, making minor changes, blah, 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 this is one of the most faithful adaptations I've ever seen. This change is the big one. So here's what happens in the book. Basically, everything's the same, except Ozymandias does not frame John for it.
Okay.
What happens is there's this whole side plot that is not in the movie. And I understand, and I'll get to why they make this change, because I think it makes sense. There's this whole side plot in the movie where Ozymandias has been basically kidnapping scientists and artists and all these people and stowing them away to a special island to create something. And what he creates is this giant squid monster thing.
What?
Hold on. This giant, weird squid alien looking creature. This ties into the Bubastis, the genetically engineering thing.
Okay.
He basically genetically engineers a squid into this giant, horrifying alien squid that's like the size of like 5 city blocks or whatever. But he uses all these scientists and stuff on this island to do that. Then the thing he's doing with John, which is kind of similar in the movie, is he's using John to figure out how to teleport stuff. Like him and John are working together to like figure out teleportation technology. But the issue, which he figures out, is that when he teleports any living thing, when John does it, it's fine. When he tries to use his technology to teleport anything, it explodes. It dies.
Oh.
It dies, it explodes, it doesn't work, but you can teleport the thing still. So what he does, he gets all these scientists together, they create this giant, they don't go into details of what he told them or why or whatever, but he gets all these people on this island to do this thing for him. And then eventually we see in this side story, at the end, they all get on a ship to leave this island to like go back to their lives or whatever. And then he just blows the ship up and kills all these people. But so at the end, when he teleports, it all is identical, except the movie is like, oh, it was Dr. Manhattan like blew up all these cities, basically. We have to unite against Dr. Manhattan. In the book, what happens is Ozymandias teleports this giant squid monster and it's only New York City, into the center of New York City, into Times Square. When it gets there, it dies, but it blows up, and this is why they changed it, because it's very confusing and it would take way too long to explain. He found a psychic in the real world, like a human psychic, and he like transplants the brain of the psychic into this alien creature so that when it dies and explodes, it releases like a psychic pulse. It wipes out like millions of people in New York City, but also it blasts all of humanity around the world with like a psychic wave that like creates all of this horrifying imagery in their brains that makes them like scared of this alien, basically. And so essentially he creates a fake alien invasion that the humanity then unites against the alien invasion. And so there's this giant carcass of this alien in New York City that they never explain how it died or what happened to it. It doesn't really matter. But it kills, like, wipes out like 15 million New Yorkers, whatever the number is, like millions and millions of New Yorkers. And then afterwards, all of the people in the world are like, oh my God, alien invasion. We got to unite. We got to figure out how to stop this. We got to work together. So in case more aliens come, we can defend ourselves, basically. So that's the big change. They remove all of that and they just make it, oh, look, Dr. Manhattan blew up this city. They also change it, which I like this change, to be multiple cities. It's a small change, but because in the book, it's just New York. But in the movie, they make it like New York, Moscow.
I mean, that makes sense if you're trying to unite everybody.
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. I also think I understand this change entirely because I think it works fairly well, all things considered. I think setting up and explaining a giant psychic alien bomb, squid alien bomb, would just be a nightmare. Without the movie being even longer than it already is, which is 2 hours and 45 minutes for the theatrical cut. I just cannot fathom how you would do it. It's a lot. It's even kind of messy in the book, in my opinion. It works, but it's kind of messy still. And so roughly the same goal is achieved. And I do like a small detail too, that with changing it to where John is the threat. So John does in the book, John immediately, right after it happens, because they leave Mars in that last thing I just read, and they come back to Earth, they teleport back to New York immediately into the aftermath of this. Yeah. And they see all the bodies and everything. So John like was there right after. So you kind of have a way, which is what happens in the book or in the film. Yeah. They teleport into the crater or whatever. Similar idea. And so like John was there. And so also it releases like the same like tachyon waves or whatever that is like part of John's like whenever he uses his powers and stuff. So it like leaves remnants that are like similar to like when he does stuff. I think it makes a lot of sense. We don't have to introduce this whole giant squid alien thing. And I also like that it kind of ups the stakes for everyone involved. Now, all of the people, John and all of like the Watchmen, have like more direct consequences in going along with this lie because now John has to leave. Yeah. Before John decides to fuck off because he just wants to. He's like, I'm done with this place. I'm going to go. He does the same thing. I'm going to go I'm going to go to leave this galaxy and go create become a god. Like literally, I'm going to go create a planet and life or whatever somewhere else. But now he has to because he's become the pariah that has in the in the eyes of everybody. Again, I think it's maybe the best way you could do that without it. As changes go, huge changes, I actually think it works pretty well. Again, I know it's controversial because it is very different. That being said, I kind of like it. I don't know if I prefer. I think I prefer the book's version overall because I just think it makes more sense, all things considered. But for a more succinct story, I don't mind and also kind of like I said, it kind of works with John's thing anyways, where people already had weird he's the only person with superpowers. He's already been viewed as a god. He's already kind of viewed as this weird all powerful being, making him the villain, outcasting him. Or they don't, him leaving so that, I think it makes sense. I'm going to put my dollar down and say that I actually think it's a totally fine change for something that was going to be almost impossible to do. Yeah. To translate from the book to the film.
That is fair.
Yeah. So that's the big change. That's the big one. I would be interested to hear, I'm very interested to hear other people's opinions on this change. If there's anything, I don't know if there's something about it that I'm not seeing that makes it not work. I don't think so. I think it does kind of just work fairly well overall. So yeah. I
mean, I felt like it worked. Yeah. Not having read the book.
Yeah.
I I like that the format of our show is a podcast. I don't often wish that we had video to go along with this, but I do kind of wish you guys could have seen my face when Brian was explaining the giant psychic squid bomb.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's weird. It's very weird. And again, if you're not, without reading it, it's even weird in the book reading it. But like, if you're just hearing it, it's like, what? Oh, that's wild. So yeah. All right. Those are all of Katie's questions. It's time to get into what I thought was better in the book.
You like to read?
Oh, yes. I love to read.
What do you like to read?
Everything.
So this first one is a big one because this is one of my favorite little reveals in the whole book. I thought it was so cool, and I was so disappointed that the movie doesn't do it. It's honestly it's maybe my biggest complaint about the movie because this moment I was like, ooh, like it blew my mind when I got to the end of the book. We see at the beginning of the film during the news thing, they're like talking about nuclear proliferation and stuff. We see a doomsday clock.
Yeah.
And it is counting down to midnight.
Right.
Yes.
As it does.
And you mentioned that the doomsday clock has been...
It's just always hanging out at a couple minutes to midnight to the point where I'm like, what does this even mean?
Yeah.
Unless the doomsday clock tells me that I don't have to go to work tomorrow, I don't care.
Yeah.
Quite frankly.
Fair. So that is a recurring motif at the beginning of every chapter or issue. Mm-hmm. There is a clock. And as you go, it gets closer to midnight, but also blood starts running further and further.
Like down from the top of the
page.
Down
from the top of the page towards the clock.
Yeah.
And so my initial interpretation was the same thing, that it was just sort of a metaphorical doomsday clock, basically, like, because I know we're getting closer and closer to, you know, the end of this is like nuclear war, death, blah, blah, blah. So the doomsday clock's getting closer and closer, the blood running down. I'm like, sure, fine, you know, that's the same thing, or like kind of just illustrating the same idea as we're getting closer and closer to the catastrophe. But what actually happens, so if you remember at the end of the book, at the end of the film, they get there and Ozymandias explains his whole plot.
Yeah.
He monologues his whole plot, but at the end he goes, I'm not some comic book villain. I wouldn't tell you my plan if I thought there was any chance you could stop it. I did this 35 minutes ago.
Yeah.
So the clock is counting down to midnight or noon or whatever. I think it's noon technically in New York. Because it's like the middle of the day because people are out and stuff. And like this, so the final one here, we got all this blood like over the clock. Or that's at the very end. But the lead into book number 12, I'm trying to find it here. Hold on. So the movie kind of just references it as a doomsday clock generically. Yeah. We don't see it anywhere else. And we only see it like once or twice. Here it is. So this is the lead into the final issue. Blood is right there. It's like 1 minute or whatever to 12. And then the next page, you flip it. It's an actual clock in Times Square. Oh. And the blood is all the blood from the people that were killed by the bomb going off.
Yeah.
So this whole time, as the blood has been running down, it's because he set the bomb off 35 minutes ago. So all the people have already been dead.
Yeah.
And so the clock we're seeing is the actual clock in New York.
With the blood.
With the blood on it. And that revelation blew my fucking mind. Because I totally didn't expect it to be like a real thing in the world again. And I was so disappointed that the movie doesn't do anything like that.
Yeah.
Because that moment of revelation when you're like, holy shit. The reason the blood has been running down this whole time is because, he set it off at 11:25 or whatever, and all the people have been dead, and the blood has just been slowly dripping down. And when it hits 12, that's not when the doomsday is. Doomsday was 25 minutes ago or 35 minutes ago. Anyways, one of my favorite little details that I just thought was so cool, and was wildly disappointed that the book or the film does not keep that detail in. Okay, next big thing. I'm going to try not to get into this too much because it's complicated. The entire Black Freighter storyline is excised from this movie. I mentioned that the Ultimate Cut has this. It is a subplot where a kid is sitting at a newsstand. We actually see these characters in the film. They make an appearance several times in the movie. But there's this kid sitting at a newsstand reading a comic book that is called Tales of the Black Freighter or something like that. It's a pirate comic book. One of the supplemental things is about pirates. We'll talk about that in a second, about pirate comics. But there's this whole Black Freighter storyline. Kids reading this comic, and it's in the Ultimate Cut. So it's really fascinating because it's not really related at all. And what it ultimately does is it gives us characters, this kid reading the comic, the newsstand guy, and a bunch of the other proliferary characters throughout this, the psychiatrist in the prison with Rorschach. There's a cabbie and her girlfriend or ex-girlfriend who have been fighting. There's the detective who was trying to solve like the murder of the comedian at the beginning. All these people ultimately end up in like Times Square, New York at the end when the bomb goes off. So, but we don't realize that. So we're just kind of seeing snippets of these characters' lives throughout the course of the book. And then at the end, they're all there and get killed by the squid bomb. But the kid is reading The Black Freighter, and what The Black Freighter is this comic book about, there's literally a whole comic book within this comic book that is an entirely different comic book, which is wild. It's about this stranded sailor who makes a raft, who's on an island, and he's trying to make a raft to escape, and he digs up the dead bodies of his crewmates because they're like filled with air, like bloated from the air, to use as flotation on the raft. And he's like loses his mind basically, and he's like trying to escape, and at one point a shark shows up and he kills the shark, and it's this whole big thing, and he's like eating seagulls out of midair. It's this crazy thing that this kid is reading this graphic novel, and we get it throughout the course of the book, and eventually he gets back to land and he sees this man and this woman, and he thinks I don't remember if he thinks that somehow he thinks his life has been stolen from him. It's very confusing. I don't remember the details, it's kind of confusing, which is funny because the kid within the universe says the same thing. He finishes reading it, and the newsstand guy's like, "Why are you here reading that all the time?" He goes, "Because it doesn't make any sense." But I think that the idea is that basically it boils down that he thinks this man and this woman on the beach are somehow responsible for his plight. He murders them and then he ties her body to the horse and dresses up as the guy and rides into town, like pretending to be this guy, to go back to his home because he thinks that the people there like stole his home from him or something like that. And then he breaks in and he like starts attacking the woman in the home, but then he sees these two kids standing in a doorway and realizes it's his kids and that it's his wife, and he's like attacking his own family. And then he's like horrified by this, and he runs away, and he runs back to the beach and like walks into the ocean, and the Black Freighter shows up, and it's like this ghost pirate shippy kind of thing, and he like joins the crew basically. For people who know this better, I'm sure I got a lot of details wrong there because it is kind of confusing. But anyways, this whole side plot, but it mirrors some of the stuff of like creating a villain to have a purpose and blah blah blah. It kind of mirrors a lot of thematically what is happening. And it does the thing that I was talking about where it's like intercutting frames of this kid reading this pirate comic with frames from our story that are like completely like contextually relevant with each other. It's fascinating. It's so fascinating. It's so cool. I don't think they ever could have done it well. I would actually am kind of interested to watch the Ultimate Cut just to see. I'll do it by myself. I would just watch the Ultimate Cut or just the Black Freighter parts to see how that cuts together. Because I was reading this, I'm like, how are they gonna do this? It's a whole nother story inside this story that again is not really related other than like thematically being important and having anyways, whole thing's fascinating. They cut the Black Freighter storyline, but it is in the Ultimate Cut. Zack Snyder said he didn't like how it came out, so that's why they cut it. Blah blah blah. There you go. The supplemental material, I mentioned that earlier. So each chapter ends with the supplemental material. The first like 2 or 3 chapters have sections from Under the Hood, which is Hollis Mason's autobiography. He was the original Night Owl. There's little details that I like. He explains that his first mask he put on with a string, but somebody almost ripped it off his face, and it like got caught and like blocked his vision, and he almost got killed. So from then on, he used spirit gum and like glued it onto his face, like we see them all wearing it in the movie. There's also info about how Hooded Justice was a Nazi apologist. Captain Metropolis was just straight up racist, like who like went out of his way to police like black and brown people. There are lots of like there's a lot of the political stuff in this book is in this supplemental material stuff, which doesn't really make it into the movie as much. Again, this is where we get Silhouette's backstory. And then Dollar Bill, that's his name, who I mentioned. He was specifically created by a bank chain as a publicity stunt, but they insisted on him having a cape so he would look more hero-y.
Yeah.
And his cape gets caught in the revolving door and he gets like trapped, and then the robbers just shoot and kill him. And I was like, oh, it's the
No
the
capes.
Incredibles. Yeah, it's the Incredibles thing. That's amazing. I assume that's probably the reference they're making. I don't know, but later on, we get a book about Dr. Manhattan and kind of his backstory. Most important thing, or my favorite little detail out of that, is there's a line where somebody's talking about Dr. Manhattan and I said, I do not believe we have a man to end wars. I believe we have a man to end worlds, which I don't think they ever say in the movie, but it's a good line. Then we get that, like I talked about, we get that like a history of pirate comics, and it specifically mentions the Black Freighter and the author, his name's something Shea, who wrote this Black Freighter comic, and it mentions that he disappeared. Ultimately, he's one of the people on the island that
is helping make
this giant squid.
Interesting.
Yes. Along with again, there's like artists and scientists and all kinds of people. And then I did want to mention there's one of the specific descriptions of one of the frames from one of these pirate comics was straight out of Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl. There we go. Even read today, the story induces an almost tangible sense of suffocation, so that finishing the story and putting the book down is actually a relief. The closing images, with a multitude of dead and drowned men walking across the ocean bed towards the anchor rope of the Black Freighter, which they climb to take their rightful positions on board the ship, remains some of Orlando's most haunting work on the series. Which there's that shot where they're like walking to the ship
underwater.
Yeah. We get some of the excerpts. The next one is like Rorschach's arrest records and some of his schoolwork as a kid, where he opines about how nuking Hiroshima was a good idea. One of them is a very interesting. It's just like a short excerpt from an ornithological book about owls. It's in the end of one of the stories or issues about Dan, obviously. Then we get a New Frontiersman like newspaper. And I talked about this, like the New Frontiersman just straight up reads like Alex Jones, or like a slightly more mask off Tucker Carlson. Like it's insane how just very clearly, like it just reads like every right wing propaganda you've ever read, and it's interesting to know that it has not changed at all.
Oh no, they never get new talking points.
They complain about Nova Express, which is a different newspaper or magazine. At one point, Nova Express was compared to the KKK, compared New Frontiersmen to the KKK, compared superheroes to the KKK. What about all those occasions when men have found it necessary to go masked in order to preserve justice above the letter of the law? Nova Express makes many sneering references to costumed heroes as direct descendants of the Ku Klux Klan. But might I point out that despite what some might view as their later excesses, the Klan originally came into being because decent people had perfectly reasonable fears for their safety of their persons and belongings when forced into proximity with people from a culture far less morally advanced.
Oh, God.
Yeah. No, the Klan were not strictly legal, but they did work voluntarily to preserve American culture. There's also a giant anti-Semitic political cartoon that looks exactly like Ben Garrison fucking drew it. It's the whole thing is just it's amazing. But then at the end of this, there's a note where they're talking about how a bunch of prominent artists and scientists went missing. So in this supplemental stuff, you get little hints and clues to the greater story, which is really cool. I really love it. It does mix like an epistolary novel into a standard format like graphic novel. Wrapping up almost with this stuff, one of them, in one of the sections, we get a bunch of background on Sally Jupiter. There's an article about how all the villains wanted to be nabbed by Sally, and it like includes her measurements in the art and news article and stuff like that. And there's also a little note taped in that is a Hollywood executive 6 years after. Apparently, there was in one of the early articles they were talking about, and there's a movie in the works with Sally, like about Sally Jupiter's life or whatever, of the Silk Spectre's life. And then 6 years later, there's this note from a Hollywood exec who's like, yeah, the movie's still in the works, but it's changed concepts like 8 times, and basically now it's a porno. Like, that's not how they say it, but like it's clear that like now it's just basically like a porno and stuff like that. And then you get a review. That movie does eventually come out, and there's a review for that movie that ends. This line cracked me up. The only real sadism in this film lies in the act of releasing it. The only masochism in watching it, because it's like a cheesy like BDSM like porn movie or whatever. And then there's also a really interesting article where it goes into where Sally specifically talks about her feelings as an assault victim and talks about like her relationship to the comedian and stuff, which is really like intense and interesting. And I don't know. It's like an interview she gave with like a newspaper or something like that. And then the last couple things, Veidt, at one point when they break into Veidt's office in the film and they like get the stuff off his computer, when they leave in the book, they also take a bunch of files off his desk and then they read those and then we get to read them. And it's basically stuff about like expanding his toy line and this ad for something called the Veidt method, which is very clearly like a wooey influencer workout regime about how it'll make you like super strong and handsome and blah, blah, blah. And then the last one is an interview with a Nova Express magazine where Veidt talks about like superheroes and his plan and like what he wants to be as a superhero and that sort of thing. And he talks like from a very like left-leaning perspective. And they do include parts of that article in the movie early. At one point, he's being interviewed by some guy.
Yeah.
That's that guy.
Yeah.
His name's like Doug Roth or something like that. And parts of that interview come from this excerpt from later. So, okay, that's all the supplemental material stuff. Getting into some other details that I thought were cool in the book. On page 45, there's at the comedian's funeral, and this is one of the first things that really stuck out to me, is there's this drawing of rain hitting the comedian's funeral, and the way they draw a specific raindrop hitting the little metal part of the thing, I could just hear it. Like I flipped the page and looked at it and I could immediately hear it. And I was like, that's good. I like that. Like it just very immediately elicits like an auditory like response. I just, and this comic book does it constantly. But as I mentioned earlier, the movie keeps constantly telling us that John sees the past and the future simultaneously. Like they say that several times, but the book shows us that a lot. And they kind of do it in the backstory for John, but it's not like when they do the backstory and he's like, it's 1945, I'm at a bar and a woman buys me a beer. Like that whole chapter plays out basically the same in the book. And they kind of succeed at it in the movie. I thought that was like the most effective it had been in the whole thing, was that scene, like the John backstory in the film, but it's still not quite as good as it is in the book. The movie does not explain Dr. Manhattan's mark on his forehead, his little circle thing. Basically, when he became a superhero, they insisted on branding. Like the people, his handlers were like, you got to have a symbol. And they were going to put like a little atomic symbol, like the generic like circle with like the little orbits around it or whatever. He goes, no, that's stupid. And he just draws, and we see him draw it in the movie. See him draw it. But it's the symbol for hydrogen. He just draws it on his forehead himself because he has to have some sort of mark for branding purposes. There's a little detail when after they fail to have sex, when Dan and Laurie try to have sex and he's impotent. After he wakes up later that night to go down into the basement and stare wistfully at his owl man thing, the TV is still on, but it's like on static. And the way it's drawn in this moment, Dan is naked, but he's also, the light from the TV is making him blue, so he looks like Dr. Manhattan, which I thought was a cool little detail, and the movie doesn't do that. When they go to the fire to save all the people, Silk Spectre rolls up into the building, and they're like, who are you? And she goes, I'm Smokey the Bear's mistress. Let's go. This is a weird line, but I laughed. It made it I thought it was very funny. In prison, Rorschach like black pills his psychiatrist. It's really interesting. Basically, the psychiatrist thinks he's like making progress with Rorschach, but he's not at all. And then Rorschach like tells him his whole backstory and that horrifying story with the dogs and the girl that was killed by the guy. And it like breaks the psychiatrist's spirit. And I think the implication in the book is that the psychiatrist decides he needs to do something and becomes a superhero, because at the end of the book, when he's in Times Square at the end and he gets blown up, you see him walking down the street, and I think he's wearing like a helmet and like a superhero costume, kind of. So I think the idea is that he decided, like, he bought into Rorschach's thing, is like, I gotta do something. Because yeah, you see him, like, he's like, I gotta go help. This is him, and he's wearing like
he has a helmet of some sort.
And he's like going, because there's like these two people are fighting, and he's like going to intervene, and there's this whole subplot with him and his wife, and she's like upset with him because he works too much and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And he basically leaves her in this moment. He's like, I gotta go help. I have to help in a world like this, that kind of thing. So yeah, basically, Rorschach like blackpills him into being a superhero. I mentioned in the prequel that I don't know if this story would make sense in any time other than like the 80s, like a Cold War world. There is a line in this graphic novel where they say that like, because the whole thing is that Russia, once John leaves, Russia invades Afghanistan, and Russia starts like pushing into other countries and stuff, and this causes all the tension that leads to the imminent nuclear war. And there's a line where they say, Russia claims to be securing her borders. And I was like, oh, maybe you could set that today.
Yeah.
Maybe we could set that today.
You know.
Maybe it would work better today than we would have thought. The movie makes Janie Slater, who was Dr. Manhattan's ex-girlfriend, the person who hires the hitman to kill to attempt to kill Veidt. I don't know if that makes any sense. In the book, it's just some random guy who we never see, like, but who we find out was basically paid off by Veidt or whatever. I don't know what making it be Janie adds, other than like being a character we know and that we know has ties to the whole plot. Feels a little clumsy and weird to me. I don't know. Not sure that makes a lot of sense. There's a scene that I've heard, this is in the director's cut, but that is not in the theatrical cut, where after Rorschach is broken out of prison, a bunch of these Nazis, there's like a gang that are called the Top Knots, that some of them have like swastikas and stuff on their arms. So I don't know if they're supposed to be like skinheads or something, but we don't really go into detail about like who they are or what their deal is. But they get really upset when they hear that Rorschach got broken out of prison by Night Owl, because they're like, well, they do whatever they want. And they're like, well, I know where Night Owl lives. They know where the old Night Owl lives, and they go and murder him. They break into Hollis Mason's. He like lives above he's like a mechanic now, like a retired mechanic. They break into his apartment and beat him to death with a statue recognizing his service as a superhero. Apparently that is in the director's cut, but it is not in the theatrical cut. There's a great line in the book that it did not make it into the movies, because boy, does Alan Moore sure know how to write fun, edgy observations about modern society. They're flying over the city, I think, to go somewhere. I can't remember. And Rorschach is looking down, and he goes, "Offices below, headstones marking daily graves of thousands." Which is
a mood.
Yeah. You know, it's like, it's edgy, but, you know, it's not wrong necessarily. Like, there's a certain truth to it. I get it, you know, yeah. So when we get to the end, Ozymandias reveals, you know, it's been revealed that he is the villain. In the movie, we see him like congratulating a whole bunch of scientists, and this is kind of combining a bunch of things here, like the thing where he blows up the boat with all the people that were helping him. But also in the book, there's this scene where he has this like giant atrium, this like in the Antarctic, he has this giant glass dome that is like a utopia that has like flowers. You know, it's like a what is the word?
A greenhouse?
Yeah, basically a greenhouse in the middle of Antarctica. And he has these three assistants who we've seen throughout the book who are not in the movie. They're these three Vietnamese guys that look very similar in the book. I don't know if they're supposed to be related or not. They're all dressed like identically, but they're like his servants or whatever that he apparently rescued from Vietnam during the war or something. I think there's vague implications that maybe they're also like lovers or something. I don't know. It's kind of strange, but there's a scene in the book where he brings them into the greenhouse and he's celebrating his plan coming to fruition or whatever, and he does pour them all wine, and then he sits and he monologues about like his backstory and all this sort of stuff. And then at the end of this scene, and it's similar to what we see in the movie, kind of, but at the end of this scene, like we're seeing him talking, and we keep seeing these people like from behind their heads. But then at the final shot, it kind of pulls back and reveals, and they're like clearly dead.
Yeah.
And so he like poisoned them with the wine. But he also talks about, during this monologue, he's talking about Egypt and stuff, and about how emperors buried their servants in sand in the tombs.
Yeah.
And as soon as he finishes, he kills them, he leaves, he opens the dome, and all the snow comes in and fills up this entire like vivarium or whatever, and buries these 3 people in the snow. It's a very cool scene. Again, the idea with the thing where he like has the scientists and zaps them is similar, but it's just not quite as creepy or cool as it is in the book. Because like one of them, you realize they're dead because there's just like a butterfly has like landed on his face and is just sitting there. It's interesting. When Night Owl and Rorschach arrive in Antarctica, they don't land right next to his base. They land kind of far away, and they have to get there. So Night Owl has sweet hover bikes.
Sweet.
They get on these little like hover platforms and zoom through the Antarctic snow. It's very fun. I get why they're not in it. It makes more sense to just have them right there and, walk in, but I miss the hover bikes. I mentioned the cool clock reveal later, or, earlier, and how like, oh my God, it's the actual clock in New York and blah, blah, blah. The other thing that the clock thing in this really does well is it helps that the clock, along with just the overall narrative structure, really builds tension and anticipation for the ending. The sense of the impending climax in this book is so palpable in a way that I thought just wasn't as well done in the movie. Like, I don't think it felt like it built in the same way. Like the anxiety as you read this just amps up and up and up and up and up and up and up to the very end, to the climax. And the book didn't quite, or the film didn't feel quite as well structured in that way. I prefer the fight with Ozymandias and Night Owl and Rorschach in the book. Because he's like eating dinner and they come in and try to beat him up, and he like at one point he like grabs Rorschach and like forks his sleeve to the table. It's just a lot more fun in my opinion. It's very similar, like they keep fighting and he keeps explaining and they keep trying to beat him up and he keeps fending them off. But I just liked it being at a dinner table in the book. He does catch the bullet from Laurie the same way when she tries to shoot him in the book and the movie. But in the book, it's set up. There's like a line earlier on about like a rumor or something that he can catch a bullet or something like that.
I thought that was in the movie.
Oh, was it in the movie? Okay.
Yeah,
Well, never mind. It is set up. I didn't think it was, but it is. Another little change in the book after this all goes down, Dan and Laurie just like go fuck off to a random like swimming pool room in Ozymandias' fortress and have sex. And then John wonders, because she's like, this sucks, this is all terrible, I need to be close to somebody, basically. And they go and they like are together, and then John walks in and sees them and just smiles, and then this is where he walks across. He's just like, nice, good for you guys, I'm getting out of here. And he just this is where he walks across the fountain, again the imagery from the video or the commercial at the beginning of the movie, and then he walks up the wall into like Ozymandias' office, and him and Ozymandias have this conversation where Ozymandias is like begging him to tell him that he did the right thing, and John's like, nah, I'm not gonna tell you that. and we get a little bit of that in the movie where he's like, without condemning or condoning, I understand or whatever, but he's like, but did I do the right thing? And he's like, I don't know, bye. And just leaves. And I really, it just plays out a little different in the book in a way that I preferred. And then finally, for better in the book, my last note, in the book, there's this little detail where after the world is rebuilding and everything, after everything has gone on, we get this shot of the streets of New York, and we see a newspaper and a vendor that says, RR to run for president. And we know what year it is, obviously. It's like 86 or whatever. And so you're like, oh, Ronald Reagan running for president. Okay. Yeah. And then it cuts inside to the New Frontiersmen, and they're talking about like stuff. And the kid says, oh, I can't believe Robert Redford's going to run for president. And the guy's like, yeah, we don't need a cowboy. The lines are exactly the same. Yeah. But in the movie, they actually change it to Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, that's weird.
Which is weird because the whole point is it's an alternate universe where things have played out differently.
Yeah.
So I liked the idea that like, oh, it's Robert Redford, it's somebody different.
Right.
Like, and I assume he's like kind of, maybe vaguely liberal. I don't know Robert Redford's politics. No idea. I assume the idea was, he's like maybe the liberal version of Ronald Reagan or something like that. But yeah, I thought it was very strange that they just made it Ronald
And kept the
Reagan.
line about the cowboy and everything.
Yeah, they kept it the same, which I mean, it still works because they both, I'm sure, have played cowboys at some
Yeah, I
point in their
guess
life.
so.
But, or, you know, when they were actors. It was just, I thought that was very strange. Unless the idea, and the only thing I can think is that Zack Snyder was going, see, nothing changed. Like, even though he
Right.
did all this, it's still...
We're still gonna have Ronald
I don't know.
Reagan.
Yeah, I don't know. That's the only. I thought that was weird that they made that change. But anyways, all right. Well, let's go ahead and talk about what was better in the movie.
My life has taught me one lesson, Hugo, and not the one I thought it would. Happy endings only happen in the movies.
I mentioned it, but working in Doug Roth's interview for Nova Express with Ozymandias early in the movie instead of having it in the supplemental material, I thought was a good idea. In the movie, they have Dan go visit Ozymandias and like talk to him about the whole like maybe they're trying to kill masks, as they say, whereas in the book it's Rorschach that goes and talks to everybody. I kind of liked having Dan do it. I do miss this one exchange though. There's this exchange where Veidt is like, you know, the comedians is like a Nazi, and Rorschach goes, if the comedian's a Nazi, you may as well call me a Nazi. And Veidt just goes, which I thought was good. He's just like, yeah, man, you're also a Nazi. I really liked the little detail where they actually bring Janie into the news studio to confront. It's like a little stunt that they pull where they bring her in to confront Dr. Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
She's not there in the book. They've just
okay.
talked to her, but she doesn't like come in and like, you know, confront him or whatever. I thought that was pretty good. They give Ozymandias a monologue about Alexander the Great earlier in the film. That's all the stuff with Alexander the Great that he talks about is all like at the very end in his final monologue, basically. And they kind of piecemeal it out a little bit where he mentions his admiration for Alexander the Great and his goal to unite the world or whatever and that sort of thing. Just a little bit earlier to kind of set the stepping stone of his motivation. Because I will say, that is maybe the biggest flaw in the book is that there's like not really any, in my opinion, not much in the way of like clues or breadcrumbs leading to like the revelation that Ozymandias is behind all of this.
Right.
It just sort of is like, surprise, he's the villain.
Yeah. And that was one reason that I thought that might have been the big change.
Yeah.
In the movie.
No, it's
because like it makes sense and it works, but it's not like breadcrumbed a whole lot.
No, I think the movie actually does it even more than the book does, which again is almost none at all, at least on a first read through. But I did like, you know, like mentioning Alexander the Great and unifying the world and all that sort of stuff a little bit earlier before we know he's the villain, because we don't find that out in the book until we already know he's the villain. We're like, oh, okay, now we're explaining why he's the villain. But yeah. In the book, they fridge Veidt's assistant. So that woman who's with him when he's walking out and the assassination attempt happens, she just gets shot in the head in the book and killed. Whereas I like that they kill one of the random business guys who was with them instead. She just gets shot in the leg, I think. But the rest of that scene is pretty much identical, including down to the moment where he like reaches into his mouth and like trying to stop him from eating a poison capsule, but we figure out later that he was putting a poison capsule.
Feeding him a poison capsule.
So good. There's a little moment in the prison break. In the book, after the prison break, Rorschach just doesn't have his outfit or his mask or anything, but he has a spare.
Oh.
And so him and Dan just go and pick up his spare costume.
Yeah.
I liked in the movie having him go find the psychiatrist who has his costume and getting it back from him, and the little moment where he puts on the mask and he's like, "Tell me, doctor, what do you see?" It's not in the book, and I thought that was I like that scene. The jail fight scene in the movie is more fun because it's the same thing. They walk down a hallway beating up a bunch of prisoners who are trying to like attack them, but you know, it's like 5 frames of like still punches, whereas in the movie we get to see this whole big long cool fight scene. So you know, if you're into fight scenes, that's good. Also, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but all the costumes in the movie are more modern, for lack of a better word. Other than Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan look exactly the same in the book and the movie. But Owlman, or Night Owl, and Silk Spectre both have considerably like modernized costumes, but like that still look kind of period reasonable. Like they're not like I don't know, because it is the 80s still, but like in particular, mainly Silk Spectre's her costume in the book is kind of silly looking in my opinion, which I think is fine. I think it works in the book, but I just think it would look really weird. I'm trying to find a freaking page of her in her costume. So that's her costume. It's similar, but it's like at the bottom there on the left.
Oh, yeah.
It's just kind of like blousy and like, I don't know. It's just strange. I'm not even sure what it's supposed to be. And Night Owl's is similar, but it's a little, his is pretty similar, but I don't know. I just thought they made some slight modifications that made him look a little better on camera. A little detail that I loved that I don't think you see in the book, and now I'm double checking, but when they arrive in Antarctica in the film, when Night Owl and Rorschach arrive there, you see you get a big wide shot of Veidt's fortress, and you hear like a and like a blue light lights all the windows.
Yeah,
you don't know what that is in the moment. That's him activating the device.
Oh,
yeah, because he did it 35 minutes ago. Yeah. Like before they even got there.
Right.
And so that's him doing that. I thought in the book you do see it in the sense that you see him push the button.
Right.
But I thought that little like detail of that like flash of light for people who know what transpires here, I thought was just like a really cool idea. Anyways. And my last note for better in the movie is, in the movie at the end when it all wraps up, Dan and Laurie don't seem to assume made up identities. In the end of the book, when they go and visit his mom or her mom, they're like, they've like dyed their hair and cut their hair, and like he has like, they look completely different. They have new names and everything. And I'm not sure why they needed to change their identities in the book.
They did break Rorschach out of prison.
True. But nobody knew who they were. Or no, sorry, she did. They knew who she was. Yeah, I don't know. I guess that could be it. I thought maybe nobody really noticed that they broke him out of prison. I know, because there was a lot going on. There was the newspaper because they said Night Owl broke. Yeah. Because that's how okay, I guess that could be it. Because I was just having trouble figuring out why they assumed new identities. I thought it was fine in the movie that they don't, like, they just stay.
It didn't bother me.
Yeah. You figure it's the kind of thing where you're just like, if the government sorted it out or whatever, who cares?
It feels like also like small potatoes. Yeah. After a bunch of cities get bombed. So.
All right, let's talk about what the movie nailed.
As I expected. Practically perfect in every way.
The shot of the comedian going through the window with his button flying after him in the movie is identical to the frame of it in the book. It could not be more identical. It is literally the exact shot of him going through that window in his bathrobe with the smiley face button. We see a couple times in the movie, we see this balloon flying over the city that says Gunga Diner. Which is is referenced several times in the book. It's this like floating restaurant basically that called Gunga Diner that blows up at the end when New York gets vaporized. The moment where he like voips Rorschach out of his lab mid-sentence, where he's like, I'm not leaving until I've had my say, but he's like already outside, identical to the book. Sally and Laurie's relationship I thought was pretty much spot on. How Sally Laurie like resents Sally for like forcing her into being a superhero. We get more of it in the book, but I thought overall they did a really good job. And I really liked, I don't remember that actress's name, but whoever plays Laurie, or Sally, I thought did a really good job.
They did a really good job with her like old age makeup.
Yeah,
too.
she looked really good with old age makeup. Yeah. We get the shot of the giant Dr. Manhattan walking through Vietnam, just vaporizing people. That frame is directly out of the graphic novel. Same with the comedian flamethrowing everybody. There's the little moment where they try to start up the Watchmen the first time, and a comedian's like, this is stupid, it's all a joke, and he lights the map on fire, and he says, Ozymandias here will be the smartest man left on the sender, or whatever, directly out of the book. When John gets vaporized in the machine, looks exactly the same as it does in the movie. Like the book and the movie are like exactly the same. It's crazy. I say it's crazy. It's not, because everything looks exactly the same, but it is impressive how much it looks the same, or how identical. They kept that particular moment of him getting vaporized.
Yeah.
Yeah. The dead Moloch reveal where he goes in and then like we think he's sitting there and then you see the cigarette burn down too far and then he's got a bullet hole in his head. Awesome. Liked that. The whole child kidnapping story with the dogs is the most upsetting part of this graphic novel maybe, but it's also identical to what happens in the movie and the book. I talked about it, but the naked nightmare that Dan has where they're on the moon and then they rip their skin off, revealing their costumes, and then they get hit by a nuke and like vaporize. Exactly what happens in the book. Dan and Rorschach have their heart-to-heart where Rorschach's like, I know it can be hard to be my friend, and Dan's like, yeah, you kind of suck. And they're like, I know, I'm sorry. Their weird friendship. I love the line where this is better in the movie, and I meant to mention earlier, but they go on like a sweet when Laurie and John are on Mars, he takes her on like a sweet tour of Mars, and shows her like Olympus Mons and like this big gigantic canyon, you know, because like the biggest mountain on Mars is like the size of Missouri, he says in the book. It's, you know, bigger than any mountain on Mars, and the canyon is like 10 times the size of the Grand Canyon or whatever. But he's showing her all these things, and he has a line which they keep in the movie where she goes, tell me, how would all of this be greatly improved by an oil pipeline? Again, he's just completely disillusioned with humanity and everything going on there. So yeah, he's like, this place is pretty sick. Why would humanity make this place better? This stuff is all so cool.
A mood.
The line I mentioned earlier, which is still my favorite, that whole scene, to distill so specific a form from all that chaos is like turning air into gold. The whole monologue about how, you know, unique and special Laurie is. The Night Owl snow costume. I was so excited.
Really loved that he had a specific snow costume.
Yes. And he has it in the book and it's adorable. Look at him.
Oh, look at him. That's so cute.
And he keeps a very similar. Yeah.
He looks like a snowy owl.
Yeah, but those are their little hover bike things that they're on.
They look like Segways.
Yeah. It's amazing.
But imagine a giant snowy owl segwaying across the Antarctic tundra
so fun,
at you.
So good. We get the scene at the end where Veidt is sitting in front of like 100 TV monitors, like watching all of the news at once or whatever, and which is cool because he is doing that at the end. But there's an earlier scene in the book that I thought was really cool that I do wish they had included, where he's sitting in his HQ in front of all these monitors, and he has his assistant set it up so that they're playing every channel and they're cycling through channels like every 30 seconds. So it's just constantly changing. And he literally sits there in front of all of these changing TVs and just like gets the vibe. And he literally is like, okay, I have the vibe. Invest in porn because the vibe is horny. I'm not even kidding. I'm not even kidding. He's like, it's the same energy that was like right after World War II. It's going to be like the new baby boom. We got to invest in the adult entertainment industry.
I'm going to start saying the vibe is horny.
The vibe is horny.
The vibe is horny.
That is not his words. Those were mine. But that is essentially what he says. He just like kind of takes in the whole thing and is like, see, this is like sex everywhere. Invest in porn. It's weird. It's wild. I love it. The movie does include the reference to the Outer Limits episode at the very end. The TV turns on at Sally's house when they go to visit, and it's like playing the Outer Limits, which is, we mentioned in the prequel. The end of this is very similar to an Outer Limits episode. And Alan Moore didn't want to change it, so he just included a reference to it in the final chapter of the book. We get shots of the aftermath and the construction, and we see in the movie it says like Veidt on everything, like he's rebuilding everything. In the book, it's actually Pyramid, which is the company that, but it's a shell company of Veidt, so whatever, close enough. And then finally, at the New Frontiersman, as I said, they're a Nazi magazine. The kid who is like the assistant to the publisher or whatever, he gets a hamburger and he spills ketchup on his smiley face shirt, and it mimics the blood on the pin from the beginning, which is also in the book. So there you go. Let's get to a few odds and ends.
Okay, I almost put this in Lost in Adaptation, but then I wasn't sure that you would that like there would be an explanation of this.
Oh yeah.
In the book.
Oh yeah.
But I was curious how, and this was another thing that like confused me about whether or not these characters had powers, because I couldn't figure out how the Rorschach mask was supposed to work, and he seems like he's just a guy.
He is just a guy. So yeah, in this alternate reality, there's technology that does not exist in our world, but this is actually explained in the book, which is really cool. Rorschach, when he was young, worked at a garment factory, and when he was becoming Rorschach, and someone had custom ordered a dress that was apparently made of, quote, Dr. Manhattan spin-off fabric, end quote, whatever that means. But it was basically, it had viscous fluid that was heat and pressure responsive, sensitive, trapped between 2 layers of latex.
Oh.
The dress never gets picked up because they thought it was ugly. They're like, actually, I don't like it. We find out later, this is a weird-ass little detail, that person was Kitty Genovese, which is part of what makes Rorschach become Rorschach. We'll get to that. I'll talk about it here in just a second. But they didn't pick up the dress. Rorschach took it home because he liked it and cut it up. And he says he specifically outlines how he had to use like heated cutting implements to like seal the latex so it didn't spill those whatever. And he turns it into a mask basically. And the reason he likes it so much is that the white and black in it stay separate. They don't become gray. They don't combine because again he doesn't say this, but the implication is that he's drawn to the fact that it reflects his like very rigid view on morality. Things are black and white. But anyways, one of the things, so we find out during his sessions with the psychiatrist that one of the things that spurred him to become a superhero was the Kitty Genovese story, which I don't know if you've ever heard this. It's this myth at this point. I don't know all the details. It's very complicated. This real story that happened where this woman was assaulted and murdered in like New York City or something. And supposedly the story is that like dozens and dozens of people heard it happening for hours and nobody did anything. Like they all just like, and it's like the big place where people talk about like the bystander effect, like nobody wanted to do anything. Turns out that's not really true. The details of that story are way more complicated and people did do stuff from what I've heard. I think it's basically that whole thing is kind of a myth. In that instance, I think I don't know all the details, but anyways. But yeah, and apparently this is a weird little detail that the dress was for her, apparently. Anyways.
Speaking of, I guess, fashion. I know this is supposed to be like an alternate history. It did bother me a little bit in the movie that Laurie's smooth, straight hair and her blunt bangs, it feels so out of place to me for the 80s.
She does not have blunt bang in the.
I feel like her hair should have been permed and teased to high heaven.
In the book, she just has kind of a generic, like...
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Hairstyle. It's not really... She doesn't have, like, a blunt bang or anything like that. Yeah. Yeah, I think he intentionally avoided making anybody look particularly 80s.
I feel like she ended up with something that looked very modern, though.
You mean in the movie?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. No, I agree. I'm saying in the book, he specifically did... I think the artist intentionally tried to make it kind of timelessy. Like, if you told me asked me when this took place, I don't know if I would say the 80s necessarily.
Also, I had to fact check this while we were watching the movie to make absolutely sure, but this was before Arrested Development memified the sound of silence.
I didn't think it was because Arrested Development started in 2003, but that's from season 4, which was 2013. So yeah. Because, I had the same note. I was like, Hello Darkness Needle Drop hits a little different in 2023 than it did in 2009.
A little hard to take it seriously.
Yeah, we get to the comedian's funeral, and I was like, okay, all right. Little detail, but the actor who plays Moloch in the movie, I was like, I recognize that guy. I had to look it up. His name's Matt Frewer. Great character actor. And the thing, he was in one episode of Star Trek TNG that's pretty fun. But the thing I remember him from very vividly is he's the neighbor dad in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. I don't know if you've seen Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Not
Rick
for
Moranis
years.
film. But there's the two neighbors of like the neighbor kids. The neighbor kid's dad is that guy.
I felt like, okay, so the comedian, he's in the Minutemen and then he's in the Watchmen later, and I was like, I feel like you guys just shouldn't have let him be in the Watchmen club.
Yeah. It's never
Like,
really explained why they like want him or
just
let
like
him in. But
overall, setting everything else aside, he feels like a loose cannon.
yeah,
Like a liability.
he very much is. Yeah. Now part of it is so he's able to keep operating after the 77 law outruling or outlawing vigilantes because he works for the US government and
Right.
is just like an asset that goes and fucks up other countries and stuff and assassinates presidents or whatever. Well, I guess that was pre-77. But yeah, it's absolutely the case that he's I don't know why they decided because nobody likes him.
Yeah.
Like nobody likes him. I don't know why, well, except Sally kind of. I don't know why anybody decided that was a good idea. I didn't know if maybe there was some sort of thing where like the government was like pushing
Like, you have to include him.
or something. I don't know.
Yeah, he feels like not the best
No.
inclusion.
No, he's the worst.
Okay, so validate my thought process here. Night Owl is basically Batman,
Yes.
right?
It's very explicitly Batman.
And
yes.
Ozymandias is Iron Man.
I think there might be other, but yeah, definitely Iron Man vibes for sure.
Their superpowers are having money.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
And Ozymandias reveals and capitalizes on his secret identity.
Yes.
Like, I am Iron
Yes.
Man.
Yeah.
And Night Owl is a sad boy
Yes.
with a secret underground lair.
Yes.
He's Batman.
Yeah. I would say that Batman's wealth is probably closer to Ozymandias's as opposed to Night Owl, but definitely Night Owl is the Batman analog, like without question, for sure. He's Owl Man, like yeah, absolutely. And then I don't know what the other ones track to necessarily because the comedian doesn't particularly fit. I think you could maybe make an argument he's kind of Captain America, but like a perverted Captain America because
like a bizarro.
Well, because he does have like his costumes at times. He has like armor and like American flag. Like he has like at one point
he does wear some. Like,
he wears
American
this like
flag
blue and
stuff.
white starred like shoulder pauldron at different times. And that kind of thing, but yeah, he's not really Captain. But I think he could kind of because like the American Dream line. I think he's kind of supposed to be like this bizarro, like again, like almost like inverse, Captain America, basically like the real representation of the American Dream, according to Alan Moore. Right. You know what I mean? Who's a giant anarchist and hates everything and everybody.
No, it is interesting though because you mentioned in the prequel. That Alan Moore didn't want to do original characters.
No, originally he was going to use existing.
He was going to use existing characters, and I do think it's interesting that what ended up happening was that he kind of like used these archetypes and made them like familiar looking and feeling and.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Before we get to the final verdict, we want to remind you can do us a giant favor by heading over to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Goodreads, any of those platforms. Support us there. Follow us, like us. We would love to hear your thoughts on Watchmen. I'm sure people will have lots of them because people were amped for this one. Also, you could do us a favor by heading over to iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you can leave us a review. Give us a 5-star review. Write us a little, or 5-star rating. Write us a little review. That always helps. And if you really, really want to support us, you can head over to patreon.com/thisfilmislit. Give us a few bucks a month. At $5 a month or $5 a month and up, you get access to bonus content. Every month we release at least one episode of bonus content where we talk about a movie or something that is not based on a book. Our most recent episode, which we just put out a couple days ago, is The Emperor's New Groove. If you want to hear us a slightly more chipper, fun conversation, go check that out. We had a lot of fun talking about The Emperor's New Groove. And if you support us at the $15 and up level, you get priority recommendation status, which means you get to let us know what you would like us to review. Give us $15 a month, give us a request, and we'll add it as high as we can on the list and get it in there as soon as we can. And this was a patron request, Katie, from...
This was a request from Ben Wilcox.
There you go. Thank you, Ben Wilcox. Hope you enjoyed our discussion of Watchmen. It's time now for the final verdict.
Now, are you ready for your sentence?
Sentence? But there must be a verdict first.
Sentence first, verdict afterward.
Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen is a masterpiece. The disclaimers about my comic knowledge all hold, but even I can understand why this book is considered the gold standard for graphic novels. Every moment is so vivid, every frame filled with such detail and intrigue. The pacing is perfect as the story builds fervently to its climax. It asks deep political, moral, and philosophical questions about power, responsibility, trauma, and meaning, providing no easy answers, spinning a tragic tale where there are no simple heroes or villains. Zack Snyder's Watchmen is an interesting adaptation. It is incredibly faithful, while at the same time dropping much of the political subtext that makes Watchmen so fascinating. It adores the images on the page, and at least to some extent, understands the words as well. But this was an impossible task. There are simply too many layers, too much meat on the bone, for a single movie to ever capture the same magic that makes Watchmen the singular piece of work that it is. The biggest thing that swung my vote is that this movie is simply superfluous. It's fun to see the characters and the still images come to life on celluloid, but it was never needed. This graphic novel is already a film. It already engages the senses and the mind just as completely. You hear the raindrops bouncing off the comedian's coffin. You smell the bottle of nostalgia as it explodes against John's fortress, and you feel the electricity in the air when John is vaporized. The film does its level best to mimic the visceral experience of reading the novel, and while it succeeds about as well as can be hoped, it remains a simulacrum. And for that reason, I'm giving this one to the book. Katie, what's next?
Up next, we are doing another giant spin around.
A little bit of a 180.
And we will be covering a children's book called Lottie and Lisa, which was adapted into a film that if you are around the same age as us, you probably remember.
Oh, yeah.
Called The Parent Trap.
Absolutely. Loved this movie when I was a kid. You kidding me?
Who didn't?
Who didn't? Yeah.
Who didn't?
Great movie. Very excited to talk about this one. Did not know. Well, actually, I think I did know it was based on a book. Probably not when I saw it.
It's one of those ones that often pops up on like movies you didn't know were books lists.
Yeah. It'll be a lot of fun. Come back in 2 weeks. We're talking about The Parent Trap. But in 1 week's time, we'll hear what everybody has to say about Watchmen, get your feedback, and we'll preview Parent Trap and so much more. Until that time, guys, gals, non-binary pals, everybody else,
keep reading books,
watching movies,
and keep being awesome.